The continent existed under shadow long before the term Witcher entered the common tongue. The conjunction of the spheres brought creatures that had no place in the natural order, entities that defied the understanding of scholars and knights alike. Forests that once held deer and wolves now harbored neckers and ghouls. Rivers that sustained fishing villages became hunting grounds for drowners. The boundary between the mundane and the monstrous dissolved in the span of a single generation, leaving humanity exposed to predators it could neither comprehend nor predict. The world transformed into a landscape where survival required vigilance at every crossroads, every forest edge, every abandoned mill. Before diving deeper into the entire history of Kaer Morhen, I'd be honored if you'd like this video and consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy our content. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. Leave a comment below, and let's build this community of lore seekers together. Human settlements fortified themselves as best they could. Stone walls rose around townships, watchtowers multiplied along trade routes, and local lords assembled armed patrols to protect their domains. These measures provided limited comfort. A wall could repel bandits, yet a fog let pass through stone as easily as mist. A squad of well-trained soldiers might rout a pack of wolves, yet the same men stood helpless before a fiend's hypnotic gaze or a wraith's incorporeal form. Knights in plate armor discovered that courage and steel meant little when facing creatures immune to conventional weaponry, beings that regenerated wounds faster than swords could inflict them or that poisoned flesh with a single touch. The inadequacy of traditional military responses became painfully apparent across the northern kingdoms. Mercenaries took contracts against monsters and returned in pieces, if they returned at all. Hedge mags sold charms and wards of dubious efficacy, their rituals more theater than solution. Villages paid enormous sums for protection that failed when tested. The economic cost alone strained entire regions. As trade routes closed, farmland went uncultivated, and communities withered under the constant threat. Fear became a permanent resident in human consciousness, shaping behavior, limiting expansion, and breeding superstition in equal measure with desperation. This crisis demanded innovation. The monsters were not a temporary plague that could be waited out, nor were they simple beasts that could be hunted to extinction by ordinary means. They bred in darkness, thrived in places humans abandoned, and exploited every weakness in conventional defense. Humanity required specialists, individuals capable of matching supernatural threat with supernatural capability. The solution would not emerge from military academies or knightly orders. It would come instead from those who understood that fighting monsters required becoming something other than entirely human, something that could bridge the divide between mortal limitations and the demands of an altered world. The seeds of that transformation lay in the ambitions of mags willing to transgress boundaries their peers considered inviolable. These practitioners of magical arts observed the carnage wrought by monsters and saw opportunity where others saw only tragedy. If conventional humans could not survive encounters with supernatural predators, then perhaps humans could be made unconventional through deliberate intervention. The concept possessed a ruthless elegance that appealed to minds accustomed to viewing biological systems as puzzles awaiting solution rather than sacred boundaries demanding respect. The monster plague created conditions where extreme measures appeared justified, where ethical considerations bent beneath the weight of necessity, where experimentation that would otherwise face immediate condemnation found advocates willing to argue that survival required abandoning comfortable moral certainties. The world stood poised for transformation, though few recognized the specific form that transformation would take. Humanity needed defenders capable of operating in the shadowed spaces where monsters dwelled, individuals who could track prey through environments that sent ordinary soldiers fleeing in terror. The creation of such defenders would demand innovations in magic, alchemy, and an understanding of human physiology, advances that existed at the very edge of what contemporary scholarship considered possible. More critically, it would require willingness to sacrifice those who underwent the transformation process, accepting casualties in pursuit of creating survivors enhanced beyond normal human capability. The age before witches drew toward its close, the final decades of a period when humanity faced monsters without possessing monsters of its own to send against them. Alzur of Maribor held a reputation that preceded him through every academic hall and royal court where magical arts were practiced. His name carried weight among the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, though the weight was as often suspicion as admiration. Alzur's work focused on transmutation and mutagenic alteration, fields that existed at the uncomfortable intersection of alchemy, biology, and sorcery. Where other mags contented themselves with studying existing phenomena, Alzur sought to create entirely new forms of life, to bend the fundamental principles governing living matter into configurations nature had never intended. His treatises on genetic manipulation circulated in restricted sections of magical libraries, documents that inspired equal measures of fascination and condemnation among those few scholars granted access to such controversial material. His master, Cosimo Malaspina, provided both intellectual foundation and institutional protection during Alzur's early career. Malaspina's own work in alchemical synthesis had pushed boundaries, though never to the degree his apprentice would eventually pursue. The relationship between master and student functioned as much through mutual respect as through traditional hierarchical structure. They collaborated on projects that tested the limits of sanctioned magical research, experiments that drew scrutiny from more conservative members of the Brotherhood. Malaspina's status offered Alzur a degree of insulation, allowing him to pursue lines of inquiry that would have ended other careers before they properly began. The elder mage understood that progress in magical arts required willingness to explore territories that made comfortable practitioners uncomfortable, that breakthrough discoveries rarely emerged from research that respected all conventional boundaries. Idaran of Ulevo entered this dynamic as Alzur's own apprentice, creating a lineage of magical inquiry that stretched across 3 generations. Idaran brought a meticulous attention to documentation and process that complemented Alzur's more intuitive approach. Together they refined techniques for inducing controlled mutations in living subjects, developing methodologies that would prove essential to later breakthroughs. The 3 mags formed an intellectual nucleus around which controversial research crystallized, their work existing in a gray zone where brilliance and transgression became difficult to separate. Their laboratory at Risberg became known among certain circles as a place where the impossible was attempted with disturbing regularity, where the screams of failed experiments echoed through stone corridors late into the night, where the boundaries between healing and harm blurred beneath the pressure of relentless experimentation. The concept of creating enhanced human monster hunters emerged gradually rather than as singular inspiration. Alzur observed that conventional humans lacked the physical capabilities to reliably combat supernatural threats. Speed, strength, reflexes, and sensory acuity all fell short of what effective monster hunting demanded. Simply training humans to higher levels of skill provided insufficient advantage. A knight could spend decades perfecting swordsmanship yet still find himself too slow to react when a striga lunged from shadows, too weak to penetrate the hide of a fiend, too reliant on sight to track creatures that moved through darkness as easily as daylight. The solution required fundamental biological modification, introducing changes at a cellular level that would grant humans attributes closer to those possessed by the creatures they needed to fight. The idea possessed elegant logic: counter supernatural threat with beings who occupied the space between human and monster, individuals who retained human intelligence yet possessed physical capabilities that transcended mortal limitations. Early experimental attempts produced results that ranged from disappointing to catastrophic. Subjects expired from organ failure as their bodies rejected the introduced mutagens, tissues breaking down faster than alchemical preparations could sustain them. Others succumbed to immune system collapse, their enhanced physiology triggering responses that turned the body's defenses against itself with lethal efficiency. Some survived the physical transformation only to lose cognitive function entirely, emerging from the process as creatures that possessed enhanced capabilities yet lacked the reasoning capacity to apply them meaningfully. These failures accumulated in unmarked graves behind Risberg, silent testament to the cost of pursuing transformation that nature had never intended. Each corpse represented refinement of technique, data points that informed subsequent iterations, yet the human toll weighed heavily even on researchers accustomed to sacrificing lesser concerns for greater understanding. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers learned of these failures through channels that Alzur had believed secure. Word spread among the magical community of experiments that violated ethical boundaries the Brotherhood had established to govern research involving human subjects. Formal condemnation followed, pronounced in chambers where senior mags gathered to address threats to the legitimacy of magical practice. The censure declared Alzur's work abominable, an affront to natural law and ethical practice that brought shame upon all who practiced the sorcerous arts. The Brotherhood demanded immediate cessation of all experimentation involving human subjects, threatening consequences that extended beyond professional censure into criminal prosecution and permanent exile from magical communities across the continent. Alzur faced a choice that would define the remainder of his life and reshape the future of the continent in ways none could have anticipated. He could abandon his work, accept the Brotherhood's judgment, and redirect his considerable talents toward research that respected established boundaries. This path offered safety, continued access to resources and colleagues, and the protection of institutional authority. The alternative meant continuing in defiance of the Brotherhood, pursuing research that would mark him as renegade and criminal, accepting exile from the communities and structures that had defined his professional existence. The decision required weighing years of investment against the condemnation of peers, balancing conviction that his work served essential purpose against the isolation that defiance would guarantee. He chose defiance. The monster crisis demanded solutions that conventional research could never provide. Humanity required defenders capable of matching supernatural threats, and creating such defenders necessitated accepting costs that made comfortable scholars recoil. Alzur understood that breakthrough achievements rarely emerged from work that respected all restrictions, that transforming the possible required willingness to transgress boundaries others considered inviolable. His choice carried consequences he accepted with clear eyes, knowing that the path ahead led away from legitimacy and toward a future where his work would be judged by results rather than by the approval of institutions that prioritized propriety over efficacy. Banishment from Rissberg carried consequences that extended far beyond mere geographic relocation. Rissberg represented the beating heart of magical scholarship in the Northern Kingdoms, a repository of accumulated knowledge spanning centuries and a nexus of power where the Brotherhood of Sorcerers maintained its primary seat of influence and authority. The towers of Rissberg housed libraries containing texts that existed nowhere else on the continent, grimoires and treatises compiled by generations of mags who had pushed the boundaries of magical understanding. Laboratories within those walls possessed equipment crafted through decades of refinement, instruments calibrated to precision that could not be replicated without access to the institutional knowledge embedded in their construction. Expulsion from that institution meant severing connections to resources, colleagues, and the intricate web of protection that established magical hierarchy provided to its members. The decree stripped Alzur of official standing, transforming him in a single pronouncement from respected researcher whose controversial work generated productive debate into renegade practitioner whose experiments existed outside sanctioned bounds. The transformation carried practical implications that reached into every aspect of magical practice. Suppliers who provided rare alchemical components to Brotherhood-affiliated mags would no longer accept his coin, unwilling to risk their own standing by supporting someone formerly condemned. Colleagues who might have collaborated on research projects or shared insights now avoided association, protecting their reputations by maintaining visible distance from the disgraced experimenter. Even access to certain texts and knowledge bases closed to him, as the Brotherhood moved to contain what it viewed as dangerous inquiry by restricting Alzur's ability to draw upon accumulated magical wisdom. Castle Morhen offered refuge precisely because of its remoteness and the circumstances of its abandonment. Located deep within the Kestrel Mountains, the fortress occupied terrain hostile enough to discourage casual visitors and isolated enough that activities conducted within its walls would escape routine scrutiny from Brotherhood observers or civil authorities. The mountains themselves provided natural barrier, their peaks crowned with snow year-round and their slopes treacherous to navigate without intimate knowledge of safe passages. Travelers who ventured into those ranges did so with specific purpose, and few purposes led toward Morhen's weathered ramparts. The castle itself predated Alzur's arrival by centuries, a structure built for purposes lost to historical record and subsequently abandoned to the mountain's harsh climate when whatever function it once served ceased to justify the difficulty of maintaining presence in such forbidding location. The fortress's stone walls remained structurally intact despite decades of neglect, a testament to the quality of construction and the durability of mountain granite quarried for its original building. Wind and weather had scoured away softer materials, leaving behind the essential skeleton of defensible architecture. Towers still reached toward grey skies, their heights commanding views across valleys where approaching visitors would be visible hours before arrival. The Great Hall retained its roof, providing shelter from elements that could turn lethal during winter months when snow accumulated in drifts that buried ground floor windows. The dungeons extended into bedrock, chambers carved from living stone that maintained constant temperature regardless of season, spaces that would prove ideal for sensitive alchemical work requiring stable environmental conditions. Alzur arrived at Morgrave accompanied by those few individuals willing to follow him into exile. Some came from loyalty developed through years of collaboration, colleagues who believed in the importance of his work strongly enough to sacrifice their own positions within the Brotherhood. Others followed from mercenary calculation, recognizing that Alzur's expertise and resources represented opportunity for advancement that might never manifest within the rigid hierarchies governing legitimate magical institutions. A handful joined from genuine conviction that the monster crisis demanded solutions requiring the kind of transgressive research that made comfortable practitioners uncomfortable, that saving humanity justified accepting methods that peacetime ethics might condemn. This small group established themselves within Morgrave's walls, transforming abandoned fortress into functioning research facility through weeks of labor clearing debris, repairing essential infrastructure, and establishing the controlled environments necessary for continuing the work that had driven them into isolation. The castle's chambers transformed into laboratories where Alzur resumed his experiments with renewed determination sharpened by adversity. The failure and condemnation at Risberg had not diminished his conviction that enhanced humans represented the solution to the monster crisis threatening to overwhelm human civilization. If anything, opposition had crystallized his resolve, burning away doubt and leaving behind certainty that bordered on obsession. Here, beyond the reach of Brotherhood censure and freed from constraints imposed by institutional oversight, he could pursue his work without compromise or constant justification of methodology to peers whose timidity masked itself as ethical concern. The mountains provided isolation that served dual purpose, protecting his research from interference while simultaneously limiting contact with the very communities whose survival his work aimed to ensure. Refinement of the mutagenic process consumed years of painstaking trial and iteration, each attempt building upon insights gained from previous failures. The work progressed incrementally rather than through sudden breakthrough, gradual accumulation of understanding about how human physiology responded to specific combinations of alchemical compounds introduced at precise stages of biological development. Alzur adjusted formulas, modifying the ratio of mutagens derived from monster tissues to supportive compounds that helped human systems tolerate the foreign elements being integrated into their cellular structure. He refined the timing and sequence of mutagen introduction, discovering that certain preparations needed to be administered in specific order to avoid triggering rejection responses that had terminated earlier subjects. Techniques for monitoring subjects throughout the transformation process grew more sophisticated, allowing intervention when vital signs indicated approaching crisis points. The mortality rate decreased through this iterative refinement, dropping from near-certain termination to merely catastrophic casualties. Where initially 9 of every 10 subjects expired during or shortly after treatment, gradual improvements pushed survival rates upward until approximately half of those undergoing the process survived with stable mutations. The work remained brutal in its physical toll on those who underwent the process, weeks of agony as bodies adapted to changes that nature had never intended them to accommodate. Yet it began yielding results that approximated the enhanced capabilities Alzur had envisioned, subjects who emerged from the ordeal possessing strength, speed, and sensory acuity that exceeded normal human limitations by margins that transformed theoretical possibility into demonstrated fact. The creation of the first viable Witcher subjects marked a threshold in human history that few outside Morgrave's walls would recognize for decades. These individuals survived the transformation, retained cognitive function sufficient for complex reasoning and decision-making, and demonstrated physical capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations by significant margins. Their reflexes operated at speeds that blurred into near prescience, bodies responding to stimuli before conscious mind fully processed the information reaching enhanced senses. Their strength surpassed trained warriors, muscles restructured at cellular level to generate force that normal human physiology could not produce. Their senses detected stimuli invisible to unaltered perception, eyes that tracked movement in darkness that would blind ordinary humans, ears that distinguished individual heartbeats in crowded spaces, noses that parsed chemical information from air currents with precision approaching that of hunting dogs. They represented proof that Alzur's theories could manifest as reality, that humans could be remade into something capable of matching monsters on terms approaching equality. The 5 original witches stood as prototypes, living demonstrations that the concept worked despite all the carnage required to reach that point. Each possessed slightly different manifestations of the mutations, variations reflecting individual biological responses to the standardized process, yet all shared the fundamental enhancements that transformed them from vulnerable humans into apex predators capable of hunting creatures that had terrorized the continent since the conjunction of the spheres. Morhen had become the birthplace of an entirely new category of beings that would reshape humanity's relationship with the supernatural threats that had dominated existence for generations. Establishment of the order at Morhen represented formalization of what began as experimental success into institutional structure, the transformation of laboratory achievement into functional organization capable of deploying enhanced humans across the continent. Creating viable mutants solved only the first component of a larger challenge that Alzur and his collaborators faced. These enhanced individuals required training, organization, and purpose beyond mere existence as successful specimens. Physical capabilities alone would not suffice for effective monster hunting, a reality that became apparent during initial attempts to deploy the first viable subjects against actual threats. Raw power and enhanced reflexes meant little when confronted by creatures whose behaviors and weaknesses required specific knowledge to exploit, when fighting demanded technique refined through practice rather than simple application of superior attributes. The Order of Witches emerged to provide the comprehensive framework that would transform subjects of mutagenic experimentation into practitioners of a specialized craft. Alzur recognized that the enhanced humans needed more than the mutations granted them through the trials. They required systematic instruction in combat, deep knowledge of monster anatomy and behavior, and the discipline necessary to function as professional hunters rather than mere weapons unleashed without direction. The Order would become the vehicle through which mutated subjects received education in the practical applications of their enhanced capabilities, learning to channel strength, speed, and heightened senses toward purposeful ends rather than allowing those attributes to remain unrefined potential. The training regimen drew expertise from multiple sources across the continent, each contributing specialized knowledge that addressed different dimensions of what effective witcher work demanded. Knights from Caedwen brought martial discipline and swordsmanship refined through generations of military tradition, techniques developed on battlefields where poor form meant swift termination and excellence represented difference between survival and becoming another corpse trampled beneath cavalry charges. These warriors understood principles of leverage, timing, and positioning that made sword work effective rather than merely energetic flailing. Their instruction adapted to accommodate the enhanced speed and strength witches possessed, creating combat styles that merged classical blade work with capabilities no normal human could replicate. A witcher could execute strikes too fast for ordinary eyes to track, could generate force that would shatter normal blades against monster hide. Yet these advantages required guidance to avoid becoming liabilities through poor control or wasted motion. Alchemists from Varo contributed knowledge that transformed witchers from simple fighters into specialists capable of adapting their capabilities to match specific threats. These scholars of transformation and chemical interaction taught witches to brew concoctions that would prove lethal to ordinary humans yet granted witches temporary enhancements or specific resistances tailored to particular prey. A witcher heading into confrontation with vampires might consume preparations that enhanced blood coagulation and accelerated healing, countering the exsanguination that represented primary threat from such encounters. One-tracking specters could imbibe mixtures that heightened spiritual sensitivity, allowing perception of entities that existed partially outside material reality. The alchemical education extended beyond potioncraft to encompass understanding of monster physiology, recognition of vulnerable points in seemingly impenetrable anatomies, identification of ingredients that could be harvested from fallen creatures and processed into useful preparations. Master swordsmen added nuance to combat instruction, emphasizing elements that separated competent fighters from exceptional ones through attention to details that less experienced instructors might dismiss as inconsequential. They taught footwork that maintained balance on treacherous terrain while enabling rapid position changes, the subtle weight transfers that added power to strikes without telegraphing intention, the economy of motion that conserved energy during extended engagements. These masters understood that fighting monsters differed fundamentally from combat against human opponents, that creatures might possess multiple limbs requiring simultaneous tracking, might attack from unexpected angles that human anatomy could never achieve, might employ natural weapons against which conventional defensive techniques proved inadequate. The instruction adapted traditional swordcraft to address these challenges, developing new forms and responses tailored to supernatural threats. The combination of alchemy, combat skill, and sign magic created a comprehensive system that gave witches tactical flexibility essential for surviving the variety of threats they would encounter. Signs represented simplified magical gestures that witches could employ without extensive sorceress training, combat applications of force that required neither incantation nor elaborate ritual. Ard released kinetic force in focus bursts that could stagger charging opponents or create space when surrounded, a simple gesture that channeled power through shaped will rather than complex spellcraft. Igni conjured flame that proved effective against creatures vulnerable to fire or that used fear of burning to break morale of pack hunters coordinating attacks. Quen generated protective barriers that absorbed impacts, buying precious seconds during which witches could reposition or counterattack without accepting wounds that might prove fatal. The curriculum emphasized versatility and analytical thinking, training witches to approach each contract as unique problem requiring assessment and strategy rather than simple application of overwhelming force. Instructors drilled witches in recognizing monster species through tracks, feeding patterns, and attack signatures, building libraries of knowledge that would inform tactical decisions during actual hunts. Trainees learned to evaluate terrain, weather conditions, and available resources when planning approaches to targets, understanding that preparation often determined outcomes more surely than combat prowess. The education cultivated witches capable of independent operation, hunters who could gather information, formulate plans, and execute strategies without requiring oversight or guidance from higher authority. Early successes on the path validated the Order's comprehensive approach and demonstrated that the investment in training produced results justifying the resources expended. Witches deployed across the northern kingdoms began accepting contracts, clearing monsters from trade routes that had remained closed for years, protecting settlements that conventional forces had abandoned as indefensible, demonstrating effectiveness that no amount of ordinary soldiers could match. Reports filtered back to Morgreg of successful hunts, of creatures eliminated that had terrorized regions for generations, of communities saved by intervention that arrived where knights had failed and hope had been abandoned. A witcher dispatched to deal with a griffin terrorizing coastal villages returned with confirmation that the beast lay dead, its eyrie cleansed of eggs that would have produced future threats. Another cleared nest of neckers that had rendered valuable mining operations untenable, restoring access to deposits that represented significant economic value. The witches' reputation grew in proportion to their accomplishments, transforming them from obscure experiments conducted in remote fortress into recognized specialists with definable value to communities struggling against supernatural threats. Lords and merchants began requesting witcher services specifically, willing to pay premium rates for hunters whose success rates vastly exceeded those of conventional alternatives. The Order established networks across the northern kingdoms, developing contacts in major population centers who could direct witches toward contracts and facilitate payment collection. Protocols emerged governing how witches negotiated terms, standard practices that protected both hunters and clients from common sources of dispute. The Order's growing reputation attracted both admiration and unease from populations that benefited from witcher services. Humans saved from monster attacks nonetheless regarded their saviors with profound discomfort that gratitude could not entirely override. The cat-like eyes that allowed witches to hunt in darkness marked them as fundamentally other, visible reminder that these hunters were not fully human regardless of how human they appeared in other respects. The inhuman speed with which they moved, reflexes that blurred into motion too fast for normal eyes to fully track, reinforced perception of witches as creatures occupying uncomfortable position between human and the monsters they hunted. Whispered stories of the mutations and trials that created witches circulated through taverns and market squares, tales that grew more horrific with each retelling until the reality, itself disturbing enough, became buried beneath layers of embellishment and speculation. Yet need outweighed discomfort during those early decades when monster populations remained abundant and conventional solutions remained inadequate for addressing threats that showed no signs of diminishing. Communities might regard witches with suspicion and unease, might avoid close contact when possible and speak in careful tones when communication proved necessary, yet they continued to seek witcher services when monsters threatened lives and property. The practical value witches provided created space for their continued operation despite the social discomfort their presence generated. The order established itself across the northern kingdoms as permanent fixture of the social and economic landscape, creating networks of contacts, developing protocols for contracts, and embedding itself into the fabric of continental society as presence that would never achieve comfortable acceptance yet had become too useful to reject entirely. Morgreg stood at the center of this expanding operation, the origin point from which transformed hunters dispersed to their work and to which they returned for training, resupply, and the limited sense of community that witches could claim in world that viewed them as necessary evils rather than heroes. The expansion of witcher numbers proceeded through systematic application of the mutagenic process that Alzur had refined through years of trial and accumulated understanding. Success with the initial subjects proved reproducible, allowing the order to expand its ranks beyond the 5 original witches who had validated the concept's viability. The mutations could be induced in additional candidates with reasonable confidence that some percentage would survive the transformation, emerging with the enhanced capabilities that made witcher work possible. The order established methodologies for scaling production, transforming what had been experimental procedure into repeatable process that could be applied to new subjects as resources and candidates became available. Children became the preferred candidates for mutation, their developing bodies demonstrating significantly higher survival rates when subjected to the transformative procedures compared to adults whose physiology had already completed maturation. The young possessed adaptability that older subjects lacked, biological plasticity that allowed their systems to accommodate the radical alterations the mutations imposed. Where adult candidates typically expired from organ failure as mature tissues rejected the foreign elements being introduced, children's bodies more readily integrated the changes, adapting to the new biochemical reality rather than fighting against it. The practical advantages of using young subjects were undeniable, though the ethical implications of deliberately transforming children into something other than fully human received limited examination during this period when need dominated conscience. The order established methods for acquiring subjects through channels that ranged from socially acceptable to morally questionable. Arrangements were made with desperate families facing starvation or catastrophic debt. Transactions where children were surrendered in exchange for coin that might mean difference between survival and slow termination for remaining family members. Orphanages provided another source, institutions overwhelmed by numbers of parentless children willing to transfer custody to the order in exchange for payments that helped maintain care for those who remained. Some procurement occurred through less savory means. Children acquired through intermediaries who asked few questions and provided fewer answers about the origins of the young candidates they delivered to Morgreg's gates. The justification for these practices rested upon the monster crisis that continued devastating communities across the continent. Each child transformed into witcher represented potential for dozens or hundreds of lives saved through successful monster hunts, a utilitarian calculus that rendered individuals suffering acceptable cost for collective protection. The witches themselves, remembering their own transformations with varying degrees of trauma, held complex attitudes toward the continuation of practices that had created them. Some viewed recruitment of new candidates as necessary perpetuation of essential service, accepting that their own agony had been priced for capabilities that allowed them to protect others. Others harbored deeper ambivalence, recognizing that what had been done to them constituted violation regardless of how successfully they now functioned, yet seeing no alternative that would maintain witcher numbers sufficient to address ongoing threats. The trials refined into established procedure, systematic progression through stages designed to prepare candidates' bodies for the final transformation while eliminating those whose constitutions proved inadequate before reaching the most dangerous phases. Candidates underwent dietary preparation that lasted months, consuming specific mushrooms and herbs that began physiological changes at cellular level. These preparations altered metabolism, modified digestive processes, and initiated subtle restructuring of organ systems that would need to accommodate far more dramatic changes later. The foods were carefully calibrated mixtures that tasted uniformly unpleasant, meals that candidates consumed under supervision to ensure compliance with regimens that could not be skipped or modified without jeopardizing survival prospects during subsequent trials. Physical conditioning pushed young bodies to limits that prepared them for trauma ahead while building strength and endurance that would prove essential for surviving the mutation process itself. Candidates ran mountain trails until legs trembled with exhaustion, climbed cliff faces that tested grip strength and mental determination, engaged in combat drills that developed reflexes and taught bodies to continue functioning through pain and fatigue. The training operated under philosophy that candidates needed to approach their physical limits regularly to expand those limits, that comfort produced weakness while controlled suffering built resilience. Instructors drove candidates relentlessly, showing neither sympathy for struggles nor praise for achievements, maintaining emotional distance that prevented attachment to children who might not survive to become full witches. The trial of the grasses represented the crucible where transformation either succeeded or candidate expired in agony that no preparation could entirely mitigate. The alchemical concoction combined ingredients harvested from multiple monster species, each component contributing specific mutagenic properties that collectively restructured human biology. Forktail spinal fluid provided elements that enhanced reflexes and sensory acuity. Manticore venom contributed compounds that accelerated healing and modified pain responses. Albino bruiser tongue added factors that altered ocular structure to enable vision in near darkness. These monster-derived materials mixed with botanical components that helped moderate the transformation, bryonia and axe rib leaf and mandrake root serving as stabilizing agents that made the monster elements marginally less likely to prove immediately fatal. Administration of the mutagens proceeded according to precise protocol, carefully measured doses introduced into candidate systems at specific intervals. The initial injection triggered responses that ranged from violent convulsions to cataleptic rigidity, bodies attempting to cope with substances that violated every biological principle governing normal human function. Fever spiked to temperatures that would cause brain damage in unmodified humans, skin flushed with patterns of discoloration that tracked the spread of mutations through vascular systems, eyes clouded as ocular structures began their transformation toward the cat-like configuration that would mark witches as other for remainder of their existence. The process lasted days, candidates cycling through periods of consciousness and delirium while their bodies either adapted to the changes or succumbed to organ failure, immune system collapse, or simple biological incompatibility with the foreign elements being forced into integration. The survival rate held steady at approximately 3 candidates in 10 successfully completing the trial of the grasses, a mortality rate that represented significant improvement over earlier experimental phases yet remained catastrophically high by any standard that valued individual human life. The 7 who perished for every 3 who survived represented more than statistical casualties. They were children who had been deliberately exposed to process known to carry high probability of lethal outcome. Their bodies were disposed of with minimal ceremony, buried in grounds behind morgue where markers, if any existed, bore no names or identification. The survivors emerged from their ordeal changed at fundamental levels, mutations granting them enhanced reflexes that operated at speeds approaching prescience, strength that exceeded adult warriors despite their youth, senses that detected stimuli invisible to normal human perception. Physical alterations accompanied by changes to metabolism meant that witches processed toxins differently than baseline humans, allowing them to consume potions that would prove lethal to others yet suffering minimal adverse effects beyond temporary sensory distortions or minor physiological stress. The cat-like eyes that enabled superior night vision also marked witches as visibly inhuman, a transformation impossible to conceal and one that would shape every social interaction for the remainder of their lives. Their bodies aged more slowly than normal humans. Cellular regeneration enhanced to a degree that wounds healed with remarkable speed and the deterioration associated with advancing years manifested far more gradually than in unmodified populations. Development of the Witcher Code emerged organically from practical necessity as early witches discovered through experience which behaviors promoted survival and professional success versus which invited conflict or undermined their ability to secure contracts. Initial witches approached their work without standardized guidelines, making decisions based on individual judgment and learning through consequences when those judgments proved poorly calibrated. Some witches accepted contracts that entangled them in political disputes, finding themselves targeted by factions whose interests their actions had threatened regardless of whether those threats were intentional. Others worked without demanding adequate payment, discovering that establishing precedent for charity made subsequent attempts to charge appropriate rates met with resistance and resentment. The code crystallized through accumulated wisdom shared among witches during gatherings at Morgreg or encounters on the path. Principles emerged that addressed common pitfalls and established boundaries that protected witches from complications beyond their capacity to manage. Witches charged for their services, accepting payment that reflected danger involved and expertise required rather than working as charity or allowing clients to dictate terms based on emotional appeals. They avoided becoming entangled in conflicts between humans, refusing contracts that involved targets other than monsters and declining to choose sides in disputes that had nothing to do with supernatural threats. They refrained from making moral judgments about their employers, treating contracts as transactions rather than opportunities to impose their values on situations they imperfectly understood. The code functioned as both practical guideline and philosophical framework, defining what witches were and, equally important, establishing boundaries around what they were not. Regional deployment saw witches dispersing across the northern kingdoms and beyond, following monster populations and human settlements in patterns that established regular circuits covering vast territories. Individual witches developed routes they traversed on journeys that might span months or years, becoming familiar presences in certain regions where communities learned to expect their periodic arrival. The work was solitary more often than collaborative, most contracts requiring only single witcher and the profession cultivating independence that made prolonged cooperation challenging even when circumstances suggested it might prove beneficial. Witches traveled light, carrying equipment essential for their work yet avoiding accumulation of possessions that would complicate constant movement. The gradual abandonment by founding mags altered the order's character in ways that manifested slowly yet carried long-term implications for institutional cohesion. Alzur, Malaspina, and Adaran withdrew from daily operations as their interests moved toward other projects or their priorities shifted with accumulating years. The mags had created witches to solve the monster crisis, and with that problem being addressed through the order's ongoing operations, their direct involvement became less essential to maintaining functionality. Witches found themselves increasingly self-governing, managing training protocols, contract negotiations, and internal affairs without guidance or interference from their creators. This transition from mage-directed operation to witcher-run institution planted seeds of tension that would eventually manifest in more dramatic fashion, as witches developed perspectives that diverged from the purely utilitarian framework within which the mags had conceived them. The first stage represented peak cohesion for the order, a period when unified structure functioned with clear purpose and witches across the continent understood themselves as part of larger organization dedicated to specific mission. Morgreg served as institutional center, the fortress where new witches underwent their transformations and training, where knowledge was preserved and transmitted, where those on the path could return for resupply, repair of equipment, and limited community with others who shared their altered nature. The success of this period established witches as permanent fixtures across the continent, specialists whose services became integrated into how society addressed supernatural threats. Yet beneath the surface cohesion, philosophical differences and competing visions for what witches should be were developing among individuals whose enhanced capabilities came with minds capable of questioning the purposes to which those capabilities were directed. The foundations for future fracture existed, though few recognized them as such during years when the order's effectiveness and expansion suggested that the institution Alzur had created would endure indefinitely in its unified form. Philosophical divisions emerged gradually among the witches, differences in worldview that remained manageable when the order maintained strong central leadership yet grew increasingly pronounced as that leadership faded into absence. The question of purpose proved particularly divisive, cutting to the core of what witches understood themselves to be and why their existence justified the suffering required to create them. Some witches viewed their role as purely mercenary, a profession where services were rendered in exchange for payment without additional moral dimension complicating the transaction. They argued that witches hunted monsters because communities paid them to do so, that the relationship was commercial rather than vocational, that attempting to invest the work with deeper meaning represented sentimentality that had no place in profession built upon pragmatism and survival. Others believed witches held responsibility beyond simple contract completion, that their enhanced abilities carried obligation to protect the vulnerable regardless of compensation. These witches pointed to the children who had perished during the trials, arguing that those sacrifices demanded meaning beyond mere profit-seeking, that the horror inflicted upon candidates required justification through commitment to protecting humanity rather than exploiting it for financial gain. They advocated accepting contracts based on need as well as payment, offering services at reduced rates or even without charge when circumstances involved communities too impoverished to afford standard fees yet facing genuine threats to survival. This perspective generated friction during gatherings at Morhen, debates that started as intellectual disagreement yet carried undertones of deeper conflict about identity and the moral weight of their shared existence. Disputes over methods added practical dimension to philosophical differences, translating abstract disagreements about purpose into concrete conflicts over how Witcher operations should proceed. The Witcher mutations granted significant advantages yet also imposed limitations and vulnerabilities specific to each individual's biological response to the mutagens. Some Witchers advocated for refining the process, introducing additional modifications that might enhance capabilities further or reduce certain side effects that complicated their work. They pointed to ongoing research in alchemical circles suggesting that new compounds might be integrated into the mutation protocols, potentially creating witches with capabilities exceeding those of current generations. These proposals found support among those who viewed witches as works in progress, beings whose transformation represented first successful iteration rather than final perfected form. Others argued that the transformations already pushed human biology to acceptable limits and that further experimentation risked creating instability or unforeseen complications that might manifest years after initial mutation. They referenced failed experiments from Alzur's early work, reminding advocates of enhancement that each refinement required test subjects and that those subjects would likely include fatalities before any improvements were validated. The laboratory at Morhen became contested ground, with different factions advancing competing visions for how Witcher enhancement should evolve or remain static. Control over mutation protocols represented control over what future Witchers would be, making the dispute about methodology inseparable from broader questions about the Order's direction. Ethics surrounding the acquisition and training of children crystallized tensions already present in less articulated form throughout Witcher culture. The high mortality rate of the trials troubled certain Witchers, particularly those who remembered their own transformations with vivid clarity that years had not diminished. These Witchers questioned whether the utilitarian calculus that justified taking children for mutation truly withstood scrutiny, whether the lives saved by Witcher interventions genuinely balanced against the children who perished during trials or who survived transformation yet were permanently severed from normal human existence. Questions arose about consent, about whether children could meaningfully agree to undergo procedures that would either end their lives or irrevocably alter their humanity, removing them from the species to which they had been born and placing them in liminal category between human and other. Other Witchers dismissed such concerns as sentimental indulgence, arguing that the alternative meant allowing monsters to continue devastating innocents and that the loss of some candidates represented acceptable cost for the protection Witchers provided to vastly larger populations. They pointed to villages saved from annihilation, to trade routes reopened through Witcher intervention, to children who grew to adulthood because Witchers had eliminated threats that would otherwise have ended their lives before reaching maturity. The mathematics seemed straightforward from this perspective. Witcher casualties during training numbered in dozens or low hundreds annually, while monsters left unchecked would account for thousands of human terminations across the same period. Emotional attachment to individual candidates represented failure to grasp the scale of the crisis Witchers existed to address. These arguments grew heated as Witchers who had experienced the trials themselves brought personal testimony to debates that others approached as purely intellectual exercises. Those who remembered the agony of transformation, who carried memories of fellow candidates who had perished beside them during the process, spoke with authority that abstract reasoning could not match. Yet their conclusions varied dramatically based on how they had integrated those experiences into their understanding of themselves and their purpose. Some emerged from the trials convinced that their suffering had purchased something valuable, that becoming Witcher justified the price because it enabled them to accomplish work that mattered. Others felt that nothing could justify deliberately inflicting such transformation upon children, that their own existence represented crime rather than achievement regardless of how effectively they now hunted monsters. The absence of mage leadership created power vacuum that no single figure stepped forward to fill with authority sufficient to impose resolution on accumulating disputes. Without Alzur or his collaborators providing direction, decisions about the Order's future devolved to consensus among witches themselves, a consensus that became increasingly difficult to achieve as factions solidified around competing positions. The mags had created witches to serve specific function, yet had never established clear governance structures for how witches should manage themselves once that function was being performed adequately. The assumption had been that witches would continue operating as they had been directed, that the institutional momentum established during the Order's formation would sustain itself indefinitely without requiring active leadership. That assumption proved flawed as witches developed perspectives independent of their creators' intentions. Enhanced humans capable of analyzing complex threats and formulating sophisticated responses to those threats possessed intellectual capacity that naturally extended to questioning the frameworks within which they operated. Witches began asking why they followed certain protocols, whether alternative approaches might prove more effective, what obligations they held beyond simple contract completion. These questions threatened existing structures by introducing doubt where previously only acceptance had existed, challenging assumptions that had governed Witcher operations since the Order's establishment. Attempts at establishing formal governance structures founded on fundamental questions of authority and legitimacy that no one could answer satisfactorily. Who held the right to make binding decisions affecting all witches? On what basis should such authority rest? Some argued that the eldest witches, those with most experience and deepest understanding of the profession, should form council empowered to set policy. Others contended that age correlated poorly with wisdom and that giving power to the oldest simply perpetuated approaches that might no longer serve the Order's interests. Proposals for democratic decision-making where each witcher held equal voice attracted support from those who valued individual autonomy yet faced opposition from pragmatists, who argued that hunting monsters required clear chains of command rather than endless debate seeking consensus that might never materialize. The questions remained unresolved, leaving the Order operating through inertia and tradition rather than active leadership. Existing practices continued because they had always been followed, protocols persisted because no alternative had achieved sufficient support to replace them, yet the foundation supporting these continuations grew increasingly unstable as more witches questioned whether tradition represented sufficient justification for perpetuating systems that caused demonstrable harm. Morgrave transformed from institutional center into contested territory where different interpretations of what the Order should be competed for dominance without any mechanism for resolving the competition definitively. Different groups of witches occupied different sections of the castle, maintaining separate training protocols and operational practices even while nominally remaining part of the unified Order. Some sections emphasized the mercenary professionalism that had characterized early Witcher work, training candidates to view contracts as transactions requiring competence rather than emotional investment. Other sections incorporated elements of chivalric tradition, teaching that power carried responsibility and that witches should aspire to protect rather than simply profit from protection. These parallel systems operated side by side within the same fortress, creating a situation where new witches might receive radically different instruction depending on which faction supervised their training. The fortress that once symbolized unity became physical manifestation of fragmentation, its architecture reflecting divisions that ran through Witcher culture at every level. Tensions accumulated rather than dissipating, small grievances compounding with larger disagreements to create atmosphere where conflict felt inevitable rather than merely possible. Witches who had once trained together, who had survived the trials in the same cohorts and learned their craft under shared instruction, found themselves divided by philosophical chasms that seemed to widen with each passing season. The bonds created through shared suffering proved insufficient to bridge differences in how witches understood the meaning of that suffering and the obligations it imposed. The first age of witches approached its end, though few recognized the terminal signs until events made them undeniable. The Order had succeeded in its primary mission of creating effective monster hunters and deploying them across the continent, yet that success contained seeds of its own dissolution. Witches had become too independent, too capable of questioning authority, too diverse in their perspectives to remain unified under institutional structure that lacked mechanisms for managing the tensions their diversity generated. The fractures spread through foundations that had seemed solid during years when external threats provided sufficient cohesion to suppress internal disagreements. Now those disagreements demanded resolution, and the methods available for achieving resolution grew increasingly limited as positions hardened and willingness to compromise evaporated beneath accumulated resentment. Confrontation within Morgreg erupted from accumulated tensions reaching critical threshold where continued coexistence became impossible, and the fractures that had spread through the Order's foundations could no longer support the weight of institutional unity. The specific incident that triggered open violence has been lost to history, though fragmentary accounts preserved in oral tradition suggest it involved competing claims over laboratory resources and access to mutation formulas that different factions believed they needed to pursue their divergent visions for the Order's future. What began as argument in the corridors connecting the laboratory chambers escalated into physical altercation when words proved insufficient to resolve disputes rooted in irreconcilable philosophical differences. The first exchange of violence crossed boundary that, once breached, could not be restored through restraint or appeals to shared history. The altercation spiraled into broader combat as different factions within the castle joined the conflict, witches choosing sides based on loyalties formed through years of accumulated grievances and philosophical alignments. The violence was neither brief nor contained, spreading throughout the fortress as old grudges and ideological divisions manifested in direct confrontation between individuals whose enhanced combat capabilities made every exchange potentially lethal. Witches turned their training against each other, employing techniques developed for hunting monsters against brothers who had undergone the same transformations and learned from the same instructors. The stone halls of Morgreg echoed with sounds that had never been heard there before, the clash of witcher blades meeting witcher blades, the discharge of signs employed offensively against targets who understood precisely how to counter them because they possessed identical capabilities. The fighting possessed intensity that ordinary combat between humans could never achieve, speeds and forces involved exceeding what unenhanced witnesses could fully track or comprehend. A witcher's enhanced reflexes meant that exchanges occurred in fractions of seconds. Attacks and parries flowing faster than normal human perception could distinguish individual movements. The strength behind each strike carried potential to shatter bone or cleave through protective equipment that would turn aside ordinary blades. Signs discharged in confined spaces with effects amplified by stone architecture that channeled force rather than dissipating it, Ard blasts slamming witches into walls with impacts that would terminate normal humans instantly, Igni setting tapestries and wooden furnishings ablaze as fire spread through chambers where witches grappled with lethal intent. The toll measured in lives lost and bonds permanently severed, casualties that represented not merely numbers rather years of training and transformation invested in each individual who fell. Witches expired to the blades and signs of their brothers, each death representing someone who had survived the trials against odds that claimed 7 candidates for every 3 who endured, who had completed years of training that transformed survivors into effective hunters, who had operated successfully on the path and accumulated experience that should have translated into decades of continued service. The mutations that made witches formidable against monsters proved equally effective against other witches, perhaps more so given that both parties possessed enhanced capabilities and understood intimately the strengths and limitations those capabilities imposed. The fighting destroyed more than lives, shattering any remaining possibility of reconciliation or return to unified structure that had governed the Order since its establishment. Trust, once broken among individuals who understood better than anyone the lethal potential each possessed, could not be repaired through goodwill or negotiation. How could witches continue operating alongside others who had attempted to end their existence? How could training continue when instructors and students might belong to factions that had recently engaged in lethal combat? The violence had exposed divisions too fundamental to bridge through compromise or appeals to shared purpose, revealing that what appeared to be unified order had actually been a collection of competing factions held together by inertia and traditions that had lost their power to compel compliance. The combat eventually exhausted itself through a combination of casualties suffered by all factions and recognition among survivors that continued fighting would only compound tragedy without resolving the underlying disputes that had precipitated the violence. Witches who had been attempting to end each other moments before found themselves standing amid wreckage of what had been their institutional home, surrounded by bodies of brothers who would never walk the path again, breathing air thick with smoke from fires that still burned in sections of the fortress. The immediate threat of additional violence receded as exhaustion and horror at what had occurred imposed temporary cease to hostilities, creating space for awareness that something fundamental had changed and that return to previous arrangements was impossible. Recognition that the order could not continue in its current form arrived through grim clarity that no one who survived the confrontation could deny or rationalize away. The philosophical differences ran too deep, extending beyond mere disagreements about methodology or priorities into fundamental incompatibilities regarding what witches should be and what obligations their existence imposed. The competing visions for the Order's future proved mutually exclusive, each requiring commitments that precluded acceptance of alternatives. Maintaining facade of unity would only guarantee future violence, likely more extensive and destructive than what had already occurred, as unresolved tensions accumulated again until they demanded release through confrontation. Witches gathered in aftermath of the fighting, meeting in the great hall where bodies had been removed yet stains on stone floors bore witness to what had transpired. The assembly included survivors from all factions, individuals who had recently attempted to end each other yet now faced shared recognition that their choices would determine whether witches as institutions survived the crisis that internal conflict had precipitated. The discussions proceeded with formality born from necessity, each speaker aware that poorly chosen words might reignite violence that all understood they could not afford to repeat. Through hours of deliberation, a consensus emerged that fragmentation into independent schools represented the only viable path forward, the sole option that might preserve what was valuable in Witcher tradition while acknowledging that unity had become untenable. The decision carried sadness for some witches who had valued the sense of belonging to larger organization, and who mourned the loss of institutional cohesion that had defined their understanding of what it meant to be Witcher. Others experienced the conclusion as relief, liberation from constant tension between competing visions that had made Morgrave a place of conflict rather than sanctuary. Yet regardless of individual emotional responses, all present recognized the decision as practical necessity rather than preferred outcome. Each school would pursue its own approach to training, contracts, and internal governance without interference from others. The independence would be absolute, different schools developing entirely separate institutional cultures based on their particular interpretations of what Witcher work required and what values should guide that work. The formal dissolution of the unified order proceeded with surprising efficiency considering the violence that had precipitated it. Witchers divided resources accumulated over decades, allocating equipment, alchemical supplies, and preserved knowledge bases according to negotiations that required extensive compromise yet ultimately achieved distributions all factions accepted as adequately fair. Territories were established defining regions where each school would focus its operations, reducing likelihood of conflicts arising from competing witches working the same areas. Protocols for interaction between schools emphasized mutual non-interference, establishing clear boundaries around acceptable conduct when witches from different schools encountered each other on the path. Some witches chose schools based on philosophical alignment, joining factions whose values matched their own convictions about what witches should be and how they should conduct themselves. Others selected based on geographic preference, choosing schools whose planned territories aligned with regions they already knew well or had established contacts within. Personal relationships influenced decisions as witches followed friends or mentors into particular schools, maintaining bonds that had formed during training and early years on the path. The process was not without complications. disputes over specific equipment or access to particular formulas requiring extended negotiation and occasional arbitration by neutral parties. Yet the overall dissolution proceeded more smoothly than the violent conflict that had made it necessary. Perhaps all involved recognized that further combat would only compound tragedy already inflicted, that witches had lost enough brothers to internal conflict, and that preservation of what remained required setting aside impulses toward revenge or continued contest for dominance. The schism would be remembered as the moment when witches learned through bitter experience that unity could not be maintained through force of will when fundamental disagreements made continued association impossible. Different schools would carry forward different interpretations of what it meant to hunt monsters and what price that hunting justified, each believing itself to represent truest expression of witcher purpose, each developing identity defined partly through contrast with alternatives they had rejected in choosing their particular path. Erland of Larvik embodied certain ideals that separated him from many of his witcher contemporaries, principles that marked him as outlier even before the schism made such differences institutionally significant. Where others approached their profession with cynicism born from years witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty and ingratitude, Erland maintained convictions shaped by chivalric traditions he had been exposed to before his transformation into witcher. His origins among minor nobility in Caer had instilled values that the mutations and training at Morgreg had not entirely displaced, beliefs about honor, duty, and the obligations that power imposed upon those who possessed it. He held that enhanced capabilities carried responsibility extending beyond simple exchange of services for payment, that witches who could protect the vulnerable were obligated to do so regardless of whether protection generated profit. These beliefs made him an outsider among witches who had learned through harsh experience that sentiment represented luxury they could not afford. The profession demanded emotional detachment, ability to walk away from situations where intervention might align with personal values yet violated protocols governing witcher neutrality. Erland rejected this calculus, arguing that protocols existed to serve witches rather than witches existing to serve protocols, that rules requiring witches to ignore suffering they possessed capacity to alleviate had become perverted into justifications for moral cowardice. His perspective found limited acceptance among the broader order during years when institutional unity depended upon maintaining consensus around established practices. Challenging those practices threatened cohesion by introducing questions about whether witches were following optimal path or simply the familiar one. His 13 companions included witches drawn to Erland's vision through shared values or personal loyalty developed during years training and operating alongside him. They represented diverse backgrounds and skill sets, individuals who had arrived at Morgreg through different paths yet united around conviction that monster hunting required coupling technical expertise with ethical framework that transcended simple transaction. These witches had observed that the Order's strict neutrality and mercenary approach sometimes resulted in abandoning vulnerable populations or enabling injustice in pursuit of payment. A witcher might clear monsters from estate belonging to cruel lord who exploited his subjects mercilessly, collecting generous fee while contributing to continued suffering of populations the witcher ostensibly served through making their region safer. Such contradictions troubled witches who believed their work should align with protecting innocence rather than merely serving whoever possessed coin to hire them. They sought alternative approach that preserved witcher effectiveness while incorporating principles of honor, protection, and service that elevated the profession beyond mercenary work. Erland provided focal point for these aspirations, articulating philosophy that synthesized witcher pragmatism with knightly idealism in ways that resonated with those who had felt incomplete alignment with the Order's dominant culture. His ability to express complex ideas clearly, combined with demonstrated competence on the path that gave his arguments credibility others might have lacked, made him natural leader for faction that might otherwise have remained collection of individuals sharing similar discomfort without coalescing into organized alternative to prevailing approaches. The founding vision for the School of the Griffin emerged through conversations and debates that extended across months during the period leading to formal schism. Erland and his companions discussed what their school would represent, how it would train new witches, what values it would instill alongside combat skills and alchemical knowledge. These discussions occurred in chambers of Morgreg where walls bore scorch marks from recent combat, constant reminders that disagreements about Witcher purpose could escalate into violence when not channeled into productive directions. The group determined that their school would emphasize certain priorities that had received insufficient attention within the broader order, areas where they believed Witcher practice could and should evolve beyond current limitations. Griffin Witchers would emphasize versatility in sign magic, developing proficiency that exceeded what most Witchers considered necessary or practical. The standard Witcher education treated signs as supplementary tools, useful in specific circumstances yet secondary to swordsmanship and alchemical preparation. Erland's faction believed this represented missed opportunity, that signs offered tactical flexibility that could prove decisive in encounters where conventional approaches failed. They envisioned witches capable of employing signs with creativity and precision that transformed simple combat gestures into sophisticated techniques applicable to a wide range of situations. This emphasis would require additional training time and focus that other schools might allocate differently, yet the Griffin philosophy held that versatility justified the investment. They would accept contracts based on need as well as payment, offering services at reduced rates or even without charge when circumstances warranted. This represented radical departure from standard Witcher practice, which treated payment as prerequisite for service rather than optional consideration. The Griffin approach acknowledged that communities most desperately requiring protection often lacked resources to pay standard rates, creating a situation where those most vulnerable received least help. Griffin Witchers would evaluate contracts based on genuine threat posed and communities' capacity to pay, adjusting fees or waiving them entirely when protecting innocents demanded it. The approach risked exploitation by those who might falsely claim poverty to avoid payment, yet the Griffins believed that risk was acceptable cost of ensuring their services reached those who needed them most. They would cultivate discipline and restraint, recognizing that power untempered by judgment could cause harm as easily as prevent it. Witcher capabilities made them dangerous to anyone who provoked their anger or appeared to threaten them, capabilities that could be misused against humans who posed no genuine threat yet triggered Witcher responses through misunderstanding or fear. Griffin training would emphasize control, teaching Witchers to measure their responses proportionally to actual threats rather than reacting with full force to any perceived challenge. This discipline extended to how Griffins would interact with communities, maintaining professional demeanor even when faced with hostility or prejudice that made such restraint difficult. They would demonstrate through conduct that Witchers could be trusted with power they possessed, that enhanced capabilities did not automatically lead to abuse. Their departure from Morgrave carried symbolic weight beyond the practical reality of Witchers leaving to establish independent school. Erland and his 13 walked out through gates that had admitted them as candidates and released them as hunters, departing toward uncertain future guided by principles that some dismissed as naive yet others recognized as necessary correction to the Order's moral compromises. They carried equipment salvaged from the division of resources that had followed the formal dissolution, swords and armor that bore marks of previous owners who had perished during the schism or chosen different paths. They carried mutation knowledge encoded in formulas and procedures memorized through years of study, information that would allow them to create new Griffin Witchers when they established their school and recruited candidates. Most importantly, they carried vision for what Witchers could become if they chose aspiration over cynicism, if they rejected the notion that mutation required abandoning all claim to humanity or ethical principle. The departure headed west, toward regions where Erland believed they could establish headquarters away from areas other schools would claim. The journey would take weeks through terrain that tested even Witcher endurance, yet the group maintained cohesion through shared commitment to the vision that had motivated their departure. They discussed training protocols they would implement, how they would structure their school's hierarchy, what standards they would maintain for accepting new members. These conversations refined their philosophy, transforming abstract principles into concrete plans that would guide the School of the Griffin through its establishment and early years. The precedents set by Erland's departure established pattern that other schools would follow in developing their own distinct identities. His willingness to break completely from Morgrave, to forge entirely new institutional identity rather than simply reorganizing within the existing structure, demonstrated that alternative approaches were viable. Other factions observed that the Griffins had successfully separated from the Order without triggering additional violence or facing immediate catastrophic failure, evidence that independent schools could function effectively despite lacking the resources and established networks the unified order had accumulated. This observation encouraged other groups to pursue their own departures, each seeking to establish school reflecting their particular interpretation of what witcher work required. The School of the Griffin would develop reputation for producing witchers who combined combat effectiveness with moral consideration, who could fight monsters with efficiency and treat humans with decency that extended beyond mere professional courtesy. Their graduates would be recognized by approach to contracts that evaluated more than simple payment, by willingness to assist communities that other witches might bypass as unprofitable, by restraint when dealing with humans who feared or resented them. The school would face criticism from other witches who viewed their principles as weakness or dangerous sentimentality that undermined witcher neutrality, yet would also earn respect from those who recognized that the Griffins demonstrated capabilities equal to any school while maintaining ethical standards others had abandoned. Erland's legacy would influence how later generations understood the possibilities inherent in witcher existence, proving that mutation need not require abandoning all connection to human values or ethical frameworks. His choice to establish school built on principles of honor and service would stand as counterpoint to schools that embraced cold pragmatism or mercenary ruthlessness, demonstrating that multiple valid interpretations of witcher identity could coexist even after the unified order had fractured. Erland of Larvik left Morgrave heading toward destiny that would define him and his school as exemplars of a particular path, one that insisted witches could be more than monsters hunting monsters, that they could aspire to something approaching the heroic ideals that normal humans projected onto them despite knowing better than to expect such heroism from beings they fundamentally distrusted. The School of the Bear predated Erland's formal departure from Morgrave, holding distinction as the first faction to break away from a unified order during the escalating conflicts that preceded the Schism. Bear witches had developed identity distinct from their peers even while Morgrave maintained nominal cohesion, cultivating approach to their profession that emphasized self-sufficiency, emotional restraint, and uncompromising focus on contract completion regardless of complicating circumstances or moral ambiguities surrounding their work. They viewed witcher work as craft requiring mastery through discipline, repetition, and cold pragmatism rather than philosophical framework or ethical consideration. Monsters required removal, clients paid for that removal, and the transaction required nothing beyond professional competence and reliable delivery on contractual obligations. This perspective placed them at direct odds with witches who sought deeper meaning in their work or who believed that neutrality itself represented moral position requiring ongoing examination. The Bear philosophy crystallized through practices that had emerged during the years when witches learned through hard experience what approaches generated success and which created complications. Bears understood that witcher work necessarily involved isolation, that hunters would spend extended periods away from support networks and human companionship. They believed that emotional attachment to outcomes beyond contract completion, or concern for broader implications of their work, represented luxury that isolated practitioners could not afford. A witcher operating alone against monsters needed complete focus on immediate survival, attention undivided by larger ethical considerations or emotional investment in consequences of contracted actions. The Bear approach stripped witcher identity to its essence, enhanced human capable of performing tasks that normal humans could not accomplish, operating as tool deployed by those with resources to afford witcher services. Establishment in Hen Caddock reflected Bear priorities with uncompromising directness. The fortress in the Amel Mountains occupied terrain even more inhospitable than Morgrave, chosen deliberately for characteristics that would test witcher capability and discourage casual proximity to the school's operations. The location sat elevated on mountainous terrain where winter conditions turned treacherous months before first snow arrived in lower elevations, where isolation extended beyond mere geographic distance into meteorological reality that rendered approach impossible during certain seasons. This remoteness ensured that bears would remain largely removed from human civilization, that their training would occur far from communities that might object to practices outsiders considered barbaric. It also ensured that bears themselves would internalize isolation as fundamental aspect of their existence, that separation from broader Witcher culture would reinforce their divergent philosophical orientation. Mount Gorgon served as centerpiece for bear training regimen, a peak that candidates were required to summit as rite of passage, marking definitive transition from trainee to fully recognized Witcher capable of independent operation. The ascent tested every aspect of Witcher capability and pushed boundaries beyond what was required by actual hunt work, deliberately exceeding practical necessity in pursuit of conditioning that prepared Witchers for unprecedented challenges they might encounter on the path. Physical endurance was tested through days of climbing alternating steep terrain with exposed faces where mistakes translated directly into termination, every step requiring absolute focus and every limb pushed to limits where muscular failure seemed imminent. Mental discipline was tested through extended exposure to harsh conditions designed to trigger psychological distress and force Witchers to separate emotional responses from tactical decision-making, training minds to continue functioning effectively while bodies screamed for relief. Combat skill received testing through encounters with mountain predators that attacked climbers with predictable regularity, creatures that had adapted to high-altitude existence and viewed climbing humans as food sources or territorial threats. Witchers ascending Mount Gorgon were deliberately unprepared with specific knowledge of what predators they might encounter, forced to analyze threats encountered in real time and employ adaptive combat techniques rather than executing planned responses. Reaching the summit alone demonstrated that candidate possessed necessary qualities for independent operation, that they could rely exclusively on their own abilities when circumstances eliminated all other options or when assistance would never arrive regardless of how desperate the situation became. Those who failed Mount Gorgon either expired during the attempt through falls from heights that body-breaking forces could not survive, succumbed to injuries from predator encounters they could not overcome through individual skill, or lacked sufficient mental discipline to continue forward when doubt and fear suggested retreat as preferable alternative. Failure represented practical elimination from Witcher work rather than mere exclusion from bear school, as candidates who could not complete the ascent had proven themselves incapable of surviving the solitary existence the bear philosophy demanded. The mountains served simultaneously as testing ground for capability and as final judge determining which candidates would continue toward becoming Witchers versus which would be released as unsuitable material that had demonstrated limitations disqualifying them from profession where failure meant personal termination. The bear philosophy crystallized into cold pragmatism that some observers interpreted as admirable professionalism while others dismissed as emotional poverty masking itself as practicality. Bear Witchers charged premium rates for their services, establishing pricing that reflected genuine danger and expertise required while simultaneously functioning as filtering mechanism that ensured only sufficiently wealthy clients could afford them. The high cost served dual purpose of generating significant income for individual Witchers, providing financial security that reduced desperation that sometimes drove Witchers toward questionable contracts, while simultaneously limiting demand to reduce frequency with which bears needed to deploy. Less work meant more time for training and personal pursuits, autonomy that bears valued as essential component of their particular version of Witcher life. Bear Witchers refused to engage in negotiation once price was established, treating monetary agreements as final regardless of client circumstances or unfolding developments that might render contract more difficult than initially anticipated. If complications arose that extended contract timeline or required additional resources, the bear nonetheless fulfilled obligations at rate originally agreed, neither requesting additional payment nor adjusting scope of work to reflect unforeseen challenges. This inflexibility might appear detrimental to business relationships, yet it functioned as deterrent against clients who attempted to exploit Witcher services by misrepresenting contract parameters. A client who attempted to expand scope after initial agreement faced Witcher who maintained original terms exactly as stated and no further, precise fulfillment without accommodating human tendency toward revision and expansion. They accepted contracts without regard for client morality or the broader implications of their actions, treating each job as purely technical challenge divorced from ethical consideration. A bear employed by one lord to clear monsters from territories seized from rival noble would execute contract without examining whether the conquest represented legitimate claim or unjust displacement. A bear hired to protect caravan carrying goods acquired through exploitation would provide that protection as competently as if the cargo represented innocent merchandise. This neutrality extended beyond geographic or strategic questions into matters of fundamental morality, bears refusing to make judgments about whether contracts involved just or unjust purposes because making such judgments required moral framework they viewed as luxury and burden they were unwilling to carry. This approach generated reputation for reliability among those who could afford bear services, creating reliable relationships with nobility and merchants wealthy enough to pay premium rates. Communities desperate for monster removal and possessed of necessary funds sought bear witches specifically, knowing that a bear contract would be completed with mechanical efficiency, without complication or deviation from agreed terms, without drama or complications resulting from witcher moral qualms about surrounding circumstances. The predictability and reliability appealed to those whose power rested on precise execution of plans, who needed tools they could deploy with certainty regarding outcomes. Bear witches offered precisely that, capable operatives who could be trusted to deliver exactly what was contracted without requiring management or oversight to ensure compliance. Their reputation across the continent reflected this dualistic perception, praised by paying clients and dismissed with distrust by communities that could not afford their services or that observed their operations from outside. Communities desperate for protection from monsters yet unable to provide compensation viewed bear witches with frustration born of knowing that the most effective monster hunters would not aid them. Other witches from schools following alternative philosophies regarded bear approaches with varying degrees of disapproval, from contempt toward those they perceived as having abandoned witcher ideals in pursuit of profit to grudging respect for the straightforward pragmatism that drove all decision-making. Bear witches remained indifferent to such judgments, understanding that reputation mattered only insofar as it affected ability to secure contracts, and their professional effectiveness ensured steady demand regardless of philosophical criticisms launched by those whose business models or ideological commitments diverged from their own. The School of the Bear established itself as distinct interpretation of witcher identity, one that embraced isolation, discipline, and unapologetic pragmatism as core values elevated to philosophical principle. They were neither the first witches nor the last to break from unified tradition, yet they set template for what independent schools could become. Organizations that preserved essential witcher capabilities while developing specialized approaches that reflected specific worldviews and priorities, creating communities of practice organized around shared values that bound members together through something far more substantial than mere geographic proximity. Evil Eye carried reputation that preceded him through channels where witches exchanged information and warned each other about individuals whose company proved ill-advised or whose conduct crossed boundaries that most practitioners maintained despite variations in their philosophical approaches. His distinctive appearance, marked by scarred facial features and a particular eye mutation that distinguished him from other witches, became recognizable identifier that warned careful practitioners to maintain distance. His approach to contracts demonstrated flexibility that crossed boundaries most witches respected with religious fervor, accepting work that involved targets other than monsters and employing methods that violated the unwritten protocols governing witcher conduct that had developed organically through decades of collective experience. Evo represented faction within the fragmenting order that viewed enhanced capabilities as tools applicable to any sufficiently profitable situation, rather than resources dedicated specifically to monster hunting within ethical frameworks that constrained their deployment. This perspective disturbed even witches with minimal ethical concerns, as it threatened the precarious social position witches occupied across the continent. If witches became perceived as simple mercenaries willing to direct their abilities toward any target for appropriate payment, willing to abandon the pretense of neutrality that at least suggested they hunted monsters rather than serving as assassins for hire, the tenuous tolerance they enjoyed might collapse into active persecution. Communities had accepted witches as necessary evils precisely because witcher services addressed specific need that other practitioners could not fulfill, that of eliminating supernatural threats. That acceptance could evaporate if witches became indistinguishable from common assassins, if their enhanced capabilities marked them as threats to social stability rather than defenders against supernatural chaos. The School of the Viper emerged from this philosophy, though the exact timeline of EVO's founding role remains subject to scholarly dispute among those few who study Witcher history with serious intellectual attention. Accounts vary regarding whether Eivor established the Viper School deliberately as expression of his philosophy or whether the school crystallized around practices he pioneered without formal institutional structure. What remained consistent across historical sources was that Viper Witches developed and maintained reputation for accepting contracts other schools refused, work involving political elements or targets whose existence challenged the notion that witches exclusively hunted non-human threats. Their training emphasized stealth and precision alongside traditional combat skills, developing capabilities that suited assassination as readily as monster elimination, creating witches whose versatility extended into applications that most schools considered beyond acceptable bounds. The School of the Cat developed independently, though its founding circumstances paralleled the Vipers in certain respects regarding relationship between philosophical orientation and institutional establishment. Cat Witches emphasized speed and acrobatic combat techniques that required modifications to traditional training protocols, creating fighters who moved with precision that bordered on supernatural even by Witcher standards. The school gained notoriety for producing witches whose emotional regulation proved less stable than other schools, mutation side effects that manifested as volatility and unpredictability in their behavior and decision-making processes. Whether this resulted from deliberate modification of the mutagenic process undertaken to achieve enhanced physical capabilities, or represented unforeseen consequence of the specific formulas cat witches employed, remains subject to debate among mags and witches who studied such matters with serious attention. Cat witches occupied complicated position within broader witcher culture, respected for their combat effectiveness in particular domains where their speed and agility provided genuine advantages, yet regarded with caution due to their reputation for erratic behavior that sometimes made them unpredictable even to those paying for their services. A cat witcher might execute a contract flawlessly, demonstrating technical skill that vindicated the fees charged, yet engage in behavior outside contract parameters that complicated relationships and made subsequent business dealings difficult. The instability that accompanied their mutations created perception that cats operated closer to the boundary between witcher and monster than other schools, that their transformations had cost them something essential to stable human personality in exchange for physical capabilities other witches lacked. Geographic dispersal across the continent followed naturally from the formation of independent schools, each seeking to establish headquarters in locations reflecting its specific priorities and philosophical orientation. The Bears chose their harsh mountains, creating school that trained witches capable of surviving existence in inhospitable terrain where comfort represented luxury and isolation represented fundamental condition of existence. The Griffins established themselves where they could maintain connections to knightly traditions that inspired their philosophy, seeking regions where feudal structures still maintained characteristics that aligned with their values regarding service and protection. The Vipers embedded themselves in Nilfgaard's political landscape, establishing presence where constant shifting of power and abundance of wealthy nobles created steady demand for services other schools refused. The cats scattered across multiple territories, establishing secondary bases rather than centralizing their operations in single location, a distribution that reflected their decentralized organizational structure and emphasis on individual autonomy. This distribution created a network of witcher schools spread across known lands, each operating with substantial autonomy yet maintaining awareness of other schools through occasional contact between witches who encountered each other on the path. Professional courtesy governed these encounters, witches from different schools acknowledging each other with respect born of shared understanding of dangers inherent in their work, even when philosophical differences made collaboration or close friendship unlikely. Intelligence about monster populations, contract information, and warning about dangerous clients circulated through informal networks maintained by witches who valued information that might preserve lives regardless of school affiliation. Specialized mutations and techniques developed as schools pursued different approaches to enhancing their witches, each school viewing human biology as material that could be modified in distinct directions reflecting school priorities. Some schools experimented with additional mutagens or modified the sequence and dosage of the trials, seeking advantages that would distinguish their graduates from witches of other schools. The Vipers developed expertise in poisons and toxins that enhanced their effectiveness in contracts involving assassination or elimination of specific targets rather than general monster hunting, studying monster venoms and creating concoctions that could terminate humans with minimal external evidence of supernatural intervention. Their knowledge of toxicology extended beyond simple envenomation into sophisticated understanding of how various poisons interacted with human physiology, allowing them to tailor lethal preparations to specific victims based on detailed knowledge of their physical conditions and vulnerabilities. The Cats modified their mutation protocols to emphasize speed over raw strength, adapting their training regimens to produce witches whose reflexes operated at levels approaching prescience, witches whose bodies moved through space with fluidity that allowed them to navigate complex terrain while maintaining offensive capability. This specialization came at cost of reduced strength compared to witches from other schools, a sacrifice Cats accepted because their philosophical orientation prioritized different advantages and their combat philosophy emphasized evasion and precise strikes over strength that relied upon overwhelming opponents through superior force. The Griffins maintained approaches more closely aligned with those developed at Morgreg, avoiding radical departures from established protocols while incorporating refinements that reflected their particular values regarding witcher training and conduct. They maintained emphasis on versatility that allowed their witches to adapt to varied circumstances, developing expertise in sign magic and understanding of human nature that enabled them to navigate social situations where other schools' witches might struggle. The Bears maintained research directed toward understanding enhancement that would extend beyond current mutations, exploring alchemical innovations that might push witcher capabilities further toward limits of what human biology could accommodate. Their experimental approach generated both innovations that other schools eventually adopted and failures that resulted in casualties among their own trainees, a sacrifice Bears accepted as necessary cost of pursuing enhancement that might generate competitive advantages. The end of the First Age marked by Morgreg's full abandonment as Witcher School, the fortress gradually emptying as different factions established themselves at new locations and the remaining institutional support for unified training structure evaporated. The castle that had served as birthplace for all witches became relic of unified past that would never return, its laboratories gradually falling into disuse as schools established their own research facilities and stopped making pilgrimages to the original location. Witches who had known Morgreg during its functional years spoke of it with nostalgia and complicated emotion, remembering the fortress as place that had shaped them yet recognizing that the institution it represented was irretrievably lost, that whatever unity they had shared had been purchased through acceptance of circumstances that were no longer tolerable to the increasingly diverse Witcher population. The different schools maintained occasional contact, witches from one school meeting those from another on the path with interactions governed by wary respect and the shared knowledge of what they had all lost through fragmentation. They operated according to protocols that emphasized mutual non-interference and cooperation against circumstances where external threats demanded unified response, yet the casual familiarity that had characterized witches of the unified order gradually faded as generations replaced those who remembered the First Age with new witches trained exclusively within their particular schools. The schools developed distinct cultures, languages, and values that made witches from different schools increasingly alien to one another despite shared foundational transformation and similar enhanced capabilities. By the time Geralt of Rivia entered training at Kaer Morhen, the School of the Wolf had become institutional expression of particular interpretation of Witcher identity, separate and distinct from competing visions that other schools embodied and maintained with equal conviction that their approach represented most authentic continuation of what witches should be. The remaining members of the Order of Witches who did not depart with any of the established schools faced practical necessity that demanded resolution through action and deliberation. These witches found themselves without institutional home, without headquarters capable of supporting training operations, without central location where knowledge could be preserved and transmitted to new candidates. Morgreg had served its purpose but was now abandoned, rejected by different factions that had established their own schools across the continent. The witches remaining at the original fortress recognized that its days as functional training center had ended, that clinging to Morgreg would only preserve them as relic of past rather than enabling them to continue witcher work in meaningful fashion. They understood that effective operation required establishing new stronghold, new location that would serve functions analogous to those Morgreg had provided during the First Age. The need for a defensible, remote location represented primary criterion guiding the search for new headquarters. Experience had demonstrated that proximity to human settlements created complications for Witcher training and research. Communities initially tolerated Witcher presence when the institution served clear purpose of protecting them against monsters, yet that tolerance frequently evaporated when the actual practices and experimental procedures required for training new Witchers became known. The screams of candidates undergoing the trials, the corpses of those who failed the transformation process, the disturbing modifications that enhanced capabilities required all generated horror and revulsion among populations lacking context for understanding that such horrors represented necessary cost of creating defenders who could protect them. Isolation provided buffer between Witcher operations and human judgments about those operations. The Blue Mountains of Caedwen presented themselves as possibility that gradually consolidated into actual location through combination of exploration and strategic evaluation. The mountain range occupied territory that remained relatively remote despite proximity to populated regions of Caedwen, offering elevation sufficient to discourage casual approach while maintaining access to supplies and resources that isolated locations sometimes lacked. The mountains possessed caves that could potentially be adapted for use as laboratory spaces, chambers where the stable environmental conditions necessary for sophisticated alchemical work could be maintained. The terrain offered natural defensibility, approaches that could be easily defended against intruders, multiple exits that would allow escape if circumstances demanded rapid withdrawal from the location. The discovery of the valley that would become Kaer Morhen emerged through systematic exploration of the mountain range. Parties of Witchers searching for location that would meet accumulating criteria for establishing new headquarters. The valley existed in terrain remote enough to discourage accidental approach, yet sufficiently accessible to allow regular resupply and communication with Witchers operating on the path. The location possessed characteristics suggesting prior occupation, ruins indicating that humans or possibly other races had inhabited the valley at some distant point in history. Ancient foundations could potentially be rebuilt, existing structures expanded and modified rather than constructing new buildings from raw materials and primitive tools available in such remote locations. The ruins suggested that the valley had housed more sophisticated civilization at some earlier period, architectural remnants displaying mastery of stonework and understanding of defensive principles that implied builders who understood need for fortification. The structures bore no obvious relationship to anything Witchers or humans currently active on the continent constructed, suggesting either very ancient human habitation or possibility that other races had occupied the location previously. The implications of such prior occupation raised questions that Witchers lacked expertise or historical knowledge to answer definitively, yet they recognized that this suggested the location had proven habitable and defensible for extended periods, evidence that current inhabitants could replicate whatever success prior occupants had achieved. Ancient elven ruins added mysterious dimension to the valley's history and characteristics. The Witchers discovered structures and artifacts bearing markings in Elder speech, indicating that elves had inhabited or used the valley at some point in its history. The ruins displayed architectural principles different from human construction, blending into landscape in ways that seemed almost organic, as though buildings had grown from stone rather than being imposed upon it. The elven presence suggested that the location occupied significance in some context Witchers did not fully understand, that the valley might possess properties or characteristics beyond those immediately obvious to casual observation. The artifacts scattered throughout the ruins would eventually be catalogued and studied, adding to accumulated knowledge about elder races and their technologies. The Circle of Whispering Stones stood as most remarkable feature of the valley's ancient heritage, a formation of standing stones arranged in precise geometric patterns suggesting deliberate construction rather than natural geological formation. The stones bore markings similar to Elder speech, though the exact meaning and purpose remained subject to interpretation and speculation among Witchers lacking expertise in Elven languages or symbolic systems. The circle occupied central location within the valley, commanding views across the entire expanse and positioned in manner suggesting astronomical or magical significance. Local legends and folklore maintained among populations in surrounding regions held that the stones possessed properties that distinguished them from ordinary stone, that the circle represented place of power or significance far exceeding what physical examination alone could establish. The decision to establish the new Witcher headquarters in the valley gradually crystallized through process of elimination and positive evaluation of characteristics the location provided. The valley offered the remoteness necessary for Witcher operations to proceed without generating immediate conflict with surrounding human populations, the defensibility required to ensure that location could be held and protected against potential threats, and the apparent infrastructure capable of supporting expanded construction and modification to serve Witcher purposes. The ancient ruins and elven presence suggested historical significance that might prove valuable, even if Witchers did not currently understand the full implications of establishing their headquarters on site that had clearly held importance for those who had occupied it previously. The valley would be formally established as new headquarters for what would become the School of the Wolf, though the naming and institutional crystallization would occur gradually rather than through single decisive moment. Initial settlement involved construction work to make existing ruins habitable, clearing debris, strengthening walls, and adapting structures for use as living quarters and training facilities. Witchers moving into the valley discovered that the ancient inhabitants had understood principles of water management, that systems for channeling mountain streams had been constructed with sophistication that suggested significant engineering knowledge. The system could be repaired and expanded, ensuring reliable fresh water supply that would prove essential for supporting larger population than the remote location could accommodate through reliance on natural sources alone. The valley that would become Kaer Morhen occupied terrain that possessed characteristics distinguishing it from surrounding regions in ways both practical and potentially supernatural. The geography reflected elevations that placed the location significantly above most settled areas of the Caedwen territory, positioning it where harsh mountain climate established natural barriers that discouraged casual approach or accidental discovery. High altitude meant that weather patterns differed substantially from lowland regions, with winter precipitation falling as heavy snow that rendered the valley inaccessible for months during particularly severe seasons. The isolation this imposed was simultaneously liability and asset, separating the Witcher headquarters from surrounding human populations sufficiently to prevent routine interference, yet creating logistical challenges that required careful planning to address. The ancient sea that had once covered this region and left its mark in geological formations deposited across the territory had long since receded into history and legend. The conjunction of the spheres had transformed the continent fundamentally, yet even the catastrophic events that brought monsters and otherworld creatures had not reversed the geological processes that had resulted in the sea's departure millennia earlier. Fossils embedded in stone told story of ancient seas, creatures that had swum through waters now transformed into solid ground and mountain passes. The circle of whispering stones stood as testament to forces operating across time frames that dwarfed human history, stones that had been positioned by intelligences far more sophisticated than those currently inhabiting the continent, intelligences that had understood principles of astronomical alignment and magical significance that Witchers lacked expertise to fully decipher. The caves scattered throughout the valley represented geographical feature that would prove essential for the fortress's functionality. These natural cavities extended deep into mountain stone, providing protected chambers where temperature remained relatively stable regardless of season, where moisture could be carefully managed through construction of appropriate channels and drains. Some caves connected through passageways that suggested either natural formation through water action across geological ages or deliberate construction undertaken to create internal communication network throughout the mountain. The caves offered potential for expansion of living quarters and laboratory spaces beyond what surface construction could provide, allowing Witchers to develop sophisticated infrastructure while minimizing above-ground structures that might draw attention from distant observers. Witchers had already established presence within the valley and surrounding mountains during years when Morgreg still functioned as unified headquarters, creating network of temporary shelters and staging areas that served Witchers operating in the region. These earlier establishments provided template for expanded settlement, locations where water sources had been previously identified and initial reconnaissance had determined which areas offered defensible positions and which routes provided access to supplies. The existing knowledge accumulated by witches who had regularly passed through the region accelerated the process of establishing permanent headquarters, as new settlers did not need to conduct complete evaluation of resources and characteristics that systematic exploration would have required. Strategic advantages presented by the valley's position became increasingly apparent as witches evaluated the location's defensive potential and logistical capabilities. The remoteness that provided isolation also meant that any force approaching the fortress would require days of climbing treacherous mountain trails, climbing that would exhaust conventional soldiers and leave them vulnerable to witches defending established positions. The routes into the valley naturally funneled approaching forces into narrow passages where small numbers of defenders could inflict enormous casualties on larger attacking forces, creating a military situation that strongly favored defenders. The fortress could withstand siege indefinitely provided internal food stores and water supplies remained adequate, resources that the valley itself provided in abundance. The Killer Trail stood as most remarkable defensive feature, a treacherous path that witches learned to navigate successfully through repeated passage yet which remained deadly obstacle to outsiders unfamiliar with its characteristics. The trail wound through mountain terrain that appeared deceptively simple at first glance, yet concealed drops sufficient to prove fatal to those failing to maintain absolute focus on their footing. Rock formations created passages that could easily lead travelers astray, directing those relying on careless navigation toward dead ends or cliff faces. Witches who trained at Kaer Morhen underwent extensive conditioning on the Killer Trail, learning to traverse it at speeds that untrained soldiers could never match, developing intimate familiarity that allowed them to navigate terrain in darkness or weather conditions that would stop normal humans completely. The trail claimed lives even among Witcher trainees, earning its name through decades of casualties among candidates who failed to develop sufficient skill or succumbed to exhaustion that made continuation impossible. The valley possessed remarkable natural beauty that stood in stark contrast to the grim purposes it would serve. Meadows during growing season produced wildflowers and grasses, creating a landscape of surprising gentleness in region otherwise characterized by rock and ice. Mountain streams flowed through the valley providing fresh water of exceptional purity, water that witches would eventually channel through sophisticated system of aqueducts and constructed waterways that allowed distribution throughout the growing fortress. The streams also provided possibility of water power, potential for construction of mills and mechanisms that could operate through force of flowing water rather than requiring manual labor or animal power. The surrounding mountains harbored monsters adapted to high altitude and harsh climate, creatures that would become subjects of study and occasional hunting by witches based at Kaer Morhen. Predators had evolved to thrive in terrain where thin air, extreme temperatures, and sparse resources demanded specialization and ruthlessness. Witches learning their craft would eventually develop contracts with communities surrounding the valley, becoming familiar with specific monsters that inhabited particular regions and the tactics most effective against them. The monsters themselves represented both threat to the fortress and educational resource, opportunities for trainees to engage with genuine supernatural threats under circumstances where experienced witches could intervene if situations progressed beyond trainee capacity to manage. The circle of whispering stones dominated the valley's center, serving as focal point for the geography and perhaps functioning as anchor point for whatever magical properties the location might possess. The stones had been positioned with astronomical precision, aligned with celestial markers in ways that suggested builders who possessed sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomical principles. Local populations surrounding the valley maintained traditions and legends regarding the stones, stories speaking of protective properties and warnings against disturbing the arrangement. Witches establishing their headquarters would integrate the circle into their understanding of the location, treating the stone arrangement with respect born partly from ignorance of its true purpose and partly from recognition that the location held significance transcending their own comprehension. The valley existed as place suspended between worlds in certain respects, location where ancient history remained physically present in the form of ruined structures and mysterious standing stones, where supernatural properties seemed concentrated in ways that distinguished the location from ordinary terrain. The choice to establish the Wolf School's headquarters in this particular valley represented recognition that the location possessed characteristics uniquely suited to Witcher purposes, that the remoteness, defensibility, and apparent magical properties combined to create circumstances nearly ideal for functioning witcher school. The witches themselves possessed limited understanding of why the valley suited them so well, operating largely from intuition and practical evaluation rather than sophisticated analysis of supernatural forces they lacked expertise to evaluate. Yet the choice would prove formative, establishing Kaer Morhen not merely as fortress or administrative center, rather as institutional focus that would define what it meant to be Wolf Witcher for centuries to come. The fortress constructed in the valley would eventually become known as Kaer Morhen, a designation derived from Elder speech that carried significance extending beyond simple naming convention. The original appellation in the ancient language of elves was Kaer Morhen, a compound construction that translated into common speech as Keep of the Elder Sea, designation that acknowledged both the geographical reality of the ancient sea that had once covered the region and the elven heritage that preceded human occupation. The name functioned simultaneously as geographical descriptor and historical marker, embedding within a single linguistic construction recognition that the location possessed layered history predating human settlement and that the fortress was being constructed upon ground that elder races had recognized and utilized according to purposes witches imperfectly understood. The corruption of the elder speech designation into the common tongue rendering occurred gradually through normal processes of linguistic evolution and the practical necessity of witches and surrounding human populations communicating using shared language. The syllables and phonetic structure of Kaer Morhen, pronounced according to elven conventions unfamiliar to human speakers, gradually simplified through repetition by individuals less practiced in elder languages. The initial syllable contracted, the compound structure resolving into binomial form, the precise vowel sounds morphing to accommodate human vocal production capabilities that differed from elven articulation. Within generations, Kaer Morhen had transformed into Kaer Morhen, the designation by which the fortress would become known throughout the continent, elder language archaeological record buried within the common tongue name but recognizable to those possessing sufficient linguistic knowledge to perceive the linguistic lineage. The symbolic meaning embedded within the name retained significance for witches who understood the linguistic heritage underlying the designation. The reference to the Elder Sea acknowledged that the location existed within context of deep time, that the mountains themselves bore marks of forces operating across geological ages dwarfing human history. The fact that a sea had once covered the region and had subsequently receded represented humbling reminder of the vast temporal scales within which human existence operated, reminder that civilizations and institutions seemed permanent yet existed as momentary arrangements within larger processes that would continue long after individual witches, individual schools, even entire human societies had passed into extinction. The keep designation within the name carried connotations connecting the fortress to traditions of fortification and defense, acknowledging that the structure served purposes of protection and preservation. A keep represented heart of defensive architecture, the location to which defenders would ultimately retreat if outer fortifications fell to assault, the final stronghold where last survivors would make their stand. The designation implied that the fortress functioned as more than mere military installation, rather as repository of something precious requiring protection. For witches, that precious thing was knowledge, training capability, and the institutional continuity that allowed witcher creation to continue across generations. The keep would preserve what mattered most to the order, even if the broader world turned hostile or circumstances threatened extinction. The connection to elven heritage and lost civilizations that the name preserved functioned as constant reminder of the deeper history within which witcher settlement existed. The witchers were not the first inhabitants of the valley, not the first to recognize its qualities as suitable for establishing stronghold or engaging in sophisticated construction projects. The elves had occupied or utilized the location previously, building structures and monuments whose purposes remained partially opaque to human understanding. The witches inherited not merely physical location but also received inheritance of knowledge that elven construction methods and the circle of whispering stones represented, even if witches lacked framework for interpreting that inheritance completely. The weight of names in witcher tradition extended beyond simple linguistic designation into realm of identity and philosophical significance. Witches regarded names with seriousness exceeding what casual users of language typically invested in terminology, recognizing that designation carried implications about nature and purpose. The school of the wolf-boar name deliberately chosen to represent specific philosophy and approach to Witcher work, witches viewing themselves as solitary hunters of individual capability rather than regimented military structures. The school of the griffin embodied its founding principles through names that referenced predator combining strength with grace, hunter that soared rather than remaining grounded. Kaer Morhen as designation for the wolf school's headquarters similarly encoded within its linguistic structure reference to continuity with previous inhabitants, acknowledgement of deep history, and commitment to serving as preserve for knowledge and capability that would otherwise be lost. The name announced that the fortress existed as more than merely practical military installation, that it connected to traditions and forces extending beyond Witcher understanding or control. To name the fortress Kaer Morhen was to accept that Witcher's inhabited location far older and potentially far more significant than their own institutional timeline, that they were establishing themselves in place of power regardless of whether they fully comprehended the nature of that power or its origins. The linguistic evolution from Elder speech to common tongue captured in the transformation from Kaer Morhen to Kaer Morhen represented in microcosm the larger process of cultural change occurring as Witcher society developed and regional populations gradually incorporated Witcher presence into their understanding of their world. The name changed because humans could not maintain complete accuracy when repeating unfamiliar language, because linguistic evolution operated according to principles of efficiency and adaptation regardless of whether those principles preserved original meaning completely. The name that witches used daily to reference their headquarters carried within its syllables record of cultural encounter and linguistic inheritance, testament to the fact that witches lived within landscape shaped by forces far older than their own institutions, that their understanding of that landscape remained necessarily partial and incomplete despite years of occupation. Witches themselves understood the significance of the name's origins and maintained consciousness of the elder speech designation underlying the common tongue rendering. Scholarly witches preserved the original appellation in records and instruction, teaching new generations that their headquarters bore name encoding recognition of ancient habitation and the deep temporal history that predated Witcher settlement. This pedagogical practice ensured that witches understood themselves as inhabitants of location that held significance transcending their own institutional timeline, that they occupied fortress that had been occupied previously and would likely be occupied subsequently if institutional continuity failed. The name served as philosophical anchor, constant reminder that witches were temporary custodians of location far more ancient than themselves, that their responsibilities included not merely maintaining fortress for contemporary use rather preserving it and the knowledge it contained for potential future generations who might require what Kaer Morhen represented. The construction of Kaer Morhen proceeded across the second half of the 11th century, occupying decades during which witches redirected energy from active monster hunting into the systematic project of establishing and developing their new headquarters. The timeline of construction reflected practical realities of working at high altitude and hostile climate, where building seasons compressed into brief windows between winter conditions that rendered work impossible and autumn weather that approached winter conditions with increasing severity. Progress could be measured in seasons rather than years, with each construction season contributing incremental advancement toward the vision of complete fortress that witches held. The work proceeded with knowledge that the project exceeded any individual witcher's lifetime, that successive generations would inherit incomplete structures and continue work toward goals that might not be achieved for decades. The probable use of existing human fortifications represented both practical necessity and stroke of fortune that substantially accelerated the development process. Ancient ruins scattered throughout the valley bore marks of human construction, foundations, and wall remains suggesting that previous generations had recognized the location's defensive potential and had begun construction projects that time or circumstance had interrupted. The witches systematized the process of examining these ruins, determining which structures possessed sufficient integrity to form foundation for expanded construction and which had deteriorated beyond practical salvage. They cleared debris from existing chambers, reinforced weakened walls, and expanded initial structures through addition of new construction that built upon existing foundations rather than requiring complete new building projects. Integration with ancient elven defensive structures represented additional advantage that witches gradually recognized as they expanded their understanding of the ruins' characteristics. The elves had constructed monuments and possibly military installations whose durability exceeded that of human construction, whose stonework displayed precision and engineering sophistication exceeding what contemporary human masons possessed. The witches incorporated elven structures into their expanding fortress, utilizing standing walls where they could and studying construction techniques that suggested principles superior to those employed in contemporary human building. The circle of whispering stones remained positioned where previous inhabitants had placed it, witches establishing their fortress around rather than destroying this ancient monument, treating the arrangement with respect born from recognition that the stones served purposes witches did not fully understand. Architectural features of the keep reflected practical needs of witcher operation combined with defensive requirements appropriate to fortress that might face assault from those who viewed witches as abominations requiring destruction. The Great Hall served multiple functions simultaneously, operating as common dining space where witches gathered to share meals, as meeting place where administrative and tactical discussions occurred, as ceremonial space where significant events in the life of the school were observed. The hall's dimensions reflected requirements to accommodate entire witcher population during winter months when regular activities proceeded in concentrated fashion. The construction featured carefully positioned openings for ventilation while maintaining defensibility, architectural problem that required sophisticated understanding of airflow and defensive requirements. The laboratory occupied position of central importance within fortress design, allocated space sufficient to support sophisticated alchemical work necessary for producing the mutagens that created witches. The chamber required specialized construction to maintain temperature and humidity conditions necessary for delicate procedures, careful placement of vents and consideration of air currents that might disrupt precise work. Storage chambers connected to the laboratory held preserved ingredients harvested from monsters killed across the previous seasons, materials requiring protection from degradation through exposure to temperature variation or moisture. The laboratory's significance extended beyond mere functional requirements into symbolic realm, representing that the keep's primary purpose involved creating new witches rather than merely maintaining existing ones. The armory housed weapons and armor maintained in constant state of readiness for deployment, storing swords, axes, and protective equipment accumulated through decades of operations. The chamber's construction emphasized climate control and moisture management, preserving steel from corrosion that would render blades useless. The armory represented tangible wealth of the keep, stocking equipment representing value that could have purchased modest estates in less remote locations. The contents of the armory represented accumulated inheritance, blades forged by master smiths now departed, equipment modified and refined through generations of witcher experience, stores that no individual witcher could replace through personal effort but that represented collective investment of the entire school. Training grounds occupied significant portion of keep's layout, dedicated spaces where witches could hone combat skills and test themselves against constructed obstacles that approximated conditions of actual monster hunts. The contraptions witches employed in training, devices such as the windmill and pendulum, required sturdy construction capable of withstanding impacts from witcher-powered strikes and movements that would demolish ordinary training equipment. The training grounds served both practical and psychological functions, spaces where candidates proved their capability and where surviving witches continuously refined their abilities through repetitive practice. The courtyard provided open space for assembling witcher population, for conducting ceremonies and demonstrations, for organizing witches into groups preparing to depart on contracts or arrive for seasonal gathering. The courtyard's position within fortress layout ensured defensibility while maintaining practical accessibility for routine activities. Witches practiced swordsmanship in the courtyard, their movements creating patterns in snow during winter months, dust during summer preparation periods. The space bore scars from years of training, stone surfaces marked by blade strikes and impacts from falling bodies of candidates who had failed tests that separated viable witches from unsuitable candidates. Building materials derived from mountain stone quarried from adjacent areas, witches establishing extraction operations that provided raw material for construction without requiring expensive transportation from distant sources. The stone possessed color and character distinct from most rock formations encountered in lower elevations, lending to the fortress distinctive appearance that marked it as uniquely part of the mountain landscape. The masonry work proceeded according to principles witches learned through observation of elven construction techniques and through trial-and-error experimentation that produced innovations as well as occasional failures requiring repair. The walls rose in courses of carefully fitted stone, thickness sufficient to provide both defensive strength and thermal mass that helped maintain stable interior temperatures despite external weather conditions. The construction project extended across generations of witches, with master builders transitioning their knowledge to successors as age or injury rendered them unable to continue active participation. The process of teaching construction techniques embedded practical knowledge into witcher culture, ensuring that future generations possessed capability to perform repairs and modifications that kept the fortress functional. The keep that emerged from decades of construction reflected accumulation of decisions made incrementally over extended timeline, representing not carefully executed plan implemented flawlessly, rather pragmatic response to challenges and opportunities that arose during the process. The architecture that resulted bore marks of that pragmatism, asymmetries and irregularities that suggested adaptation to circumstances rather than adherence to predetermined design, yet the whole functioned as coherent fortress capable of serving its intended purposes. The school of the wolf that crystallized around Kaer Morhen as institutional headquarters reflected particular interpretation of what witches should represent, philosophy that emerged through deliberate choices about training approaches, values, and the manner through which witches conducted themselves when operating beyond fortress walls. The name itself carried symbolic weight, deliberately chosen as representation of specific worldview that distinguished wolf witches from counterparts who had selected alternative designations reflecting competing philosophies. The wolf held significance in human cultural traditions extending across the continent, simultaneously representing noble qualities such as loyalty, courage, and hunting prowess, while also embodying danger, unpredictability, and threatening nature that made humans cautious around actual wolves regardless of admiration for their characteristics. The choice of wolf as symbolic representation communicated deliberate philosophical stance regarding balance and adaptability that characterized the school's understanding of what witcher work required. Unlike bears, which represented single-minded pursuit of individual power and cold pragmatism detached from broader context, wolves operated as members of packs while maintaining individual autonomy within that collective structure. Unlike griffins, which embodied chivalric ideals and courtly honor that sometimes seemed at odds with the morally ambiguous circumstances witches actually encountered, wolves existed as pragmatic hunters operating according to principles of survival and efficiency without pretending toward higher purposes that disguised mercenary motives. The wolf philosophy emphasized balance as core value, rejecting extremes that characterized competing schools while attempting to incorporate elements of multiple approaches into synthesis that seemed more practically applicable to the reality of witcher existence. Wolf witchers accepted payment for services in manner consistent with bears, yet evaluated contracts with moral consideration resembling griffin approaches, seeking equilibrium between mercenary necessity and ethical considerations that neither school alone adequately addressed. They cultivated independence and self-reliance similar to bears, yet maintained commitment to witcher communities and mutual support that prevented the complete isolation toward which bear philosophy tended. They incorporated elements of griffin chivalry without allowing honor to override practical judgment, maintaining flexibility that allowed tactical adaptation without sacrificing professional integrity. The wolf school embraced brotherhood without suffocating closeness that might compromise individual operational capability. Witchers recognized themselves as part of community while maintaining boundaries that protected personal autonomy, creating relationships characterized by respect and cooperation rather than emotional intensity that might create vulnerability. Wolves protected each other during times of vulnerability yet did not expect emotional support as fundamental right, understanding that witches operated in contexts where emotional detachment might prove essential for survival. The relationships that formed between wolf witches possessed durability precisely because they avoided illusions of perfect understanding or complete transparency of communication, accepting that witches operated as separate individuals bound together by shared training and mutual respect rather than complete fusion of identity. This philosophy stood neither at complete odds with nor in complete alignment with Griffin idealism or Bear pragmatism. The wolf school attempted to occupy a middle position that acknowledged validity of both perspectives while refusing full commitment to either. This middle path represented both strength and potential vulnerability, providing flexibility and adaptability that neither extreme approach could match, yet leaving wolves without the ideological clarity and absolute conviction that animated bears and griffins. A griffin witcher fighting for just cause could draw motivation from alignment between their actions and their values, facing struggle with assurance that their efforts served worthy purpose. A bear witcher completing contract for payment could maintain clarity of purpose and absence of moral complications that came from purely mercenary approach. A wolf witcher occupied more complex position, rarely certain whether they served justice or merely capitulated to practical necessity disguised as ethical decision-making. Development of the wolf medallion as symbol of school affiliation proceeded gradually through decades of use and refinement that transformed initial practical device into iconic representation of wolf identity. The medallions functioned as talismans, witches wearing them as visible markers of school affiliation and as tokens believed to possess protective qualities. The medallion depicted wolf's head in profile, capturing particular aspects of predator appearance while stylizing features sufficiently to transform realistic depiction into abstract symbol. The medallions resonated with witcher frequency, vibrating in response to supernatural presences and providing early warning when witches encountered threats beyond normal human perception. Different schools developed their own medallion designs bearing their particular school symbols, creating visual markers that witches could recognize from distance and that communicated institutional affiliation to those familiar with witcher culture. The wolf medallion became symbol of identity for wolf witches, worn at neck or stored in pouches carried on belts alongside other equipment. The medallion accumulated significance through years of use, witches regarding their particular medallions with attachment that extended beyond rational appreciation for magical properties. A witch's medallion had survived conditions that claimed lives, had accompanied hunter through encounters with monsters that should have proven fatal, had been present at moments of greatest fear and triumph alike. The medallion represented connection to school and to other wolves who similarly carried such talismans, creating an invisible network of shared identity that transcended physical distance separating individual witches operating on the path. The vibration of the medallion when in proximity to supernatural threats represented practical application of principles witches only imperfectly understood, magic encoded into physical object through processes preserved in formulae that witches maintained without complete comprehension of underlying principles. The medallion functioned as early warning system, sensitizing witches to threats their normal senses might miss, allowing them to prepare defenses or adjust approach based on knowledge that supernatural presence occupied their vicinity. The medallion provided tactical advantage in encounters where monsters might attempt ambush or where creatures operating partially outside normal perception might approach undetected by conventional senses. Yet the medallion also functioned symbolically, reinforcing witcher understanding that they existed within magical reality transcending purely material dimensions, that they operated with tools and knowledge extending beyond what unaltered humans could access. The significance of medallions in witcher tradition extended beyond individual schools into broader understanding of what witcher identity entailed. Each medallion bore marks of the school that had created it, carried enchantments reflecting particular approach that school employed toward magical practices, resonated with frequencies that differed slightly between schools based on their particular methodologies and priorities. Witches observing another witch's medallion could determine school affiliation, assess potential compatibility or conflict based on understanding of different schools' philosophies and approaches. The medallion functioned simultaneously as tool, as symbol, and as identifier, condensing multiple layers of meaning and function into single object that witches wore and maintained throughout their active careers. The laboratory occupied position of central importance within Kaer Morhen's architecture and within the school's operational focus, representing physical manifestation of the fortress's core purpose of creating witches through application of mutagenic principles that Alzur had pioneered at Morhen. The laboratory functioned as heart of the keep's institutional identity, the chamber where candidates underwent the trials that defined what it meant to become Witcher, where knowledge essential to Witcher creation was preserved and refined through accumulated experience of practitioners who understood transformation processes with intimacy exceeding what theoretical knowledge alone could provide. The location of the laboratory within the fortress reflected practical necessities of construction and access, positioning the chamber where it could be reached from multiple directions while maintaining security sufficient to prevent interference from those who might wish to disrupt operations. The design and function of the mutation chamber represented technological achievement reflecting decades of accumulated understanding about optimal conditions for inducing and managing transformation that redefined human physiology. The chamber required specialized construction to maintain temperature and humidity within precise parameters, architectural problem that witches addressed through combination of defensive stone chambers and sophisticated ventilation systems that allowed precise control of environmental factors. The walls incorporated materials selected for specific properties, stone varieties that maintain stability regardless of temperature fluctuation, surfaces treated through processes preserved in formulae that witches maintained without complete comprehension of underlying principles. The ventilation system employed channels directing mountain breezes through multiple filters that prevented disruptive drafts while ensuring continuous replacement of interior air. The lighting within the laboratory required careful consideration, sufficient illumination to allow practitioners to conduct delicate procedures yet designed to avoid creating shadows that might complicate observation of candidates undergoing transformation. Witches employed mirrors positioned to direct light from strategically placed openings, techniques that provided ambient illumination without exposing the chamber to external visibility that might draw unwanted attention from distant observers. The mirrors themselves became calibrated tools, their exact positioning refined through years of experimentation to achieve optimal lighting balance that enhanced practitioner ability to monitor candidates without creating discomfort or additional stress for those undergoing the torment of mutation. Alchemical equipment and apparatus occupied every available surface within the laboratory, devices serving multiple purposes from precise measurement of ingredients to controlled application of heat necessary for preparing mutagens. Scales calibrated for measuring minuscule quantities of substances allowed witches to maintain consistency in formulas where even minute variations might prove lethal to candidates. Braziers capable of achieving precise temperatures supported crucibles containing alchemical preparations undergoing cooking processes that transformed raw ingredients into potent mutagens. Vials and containers lined shelves carved into living rock, categorized storage systems that allowed practitioners to locate needed materials without wasteful searching that might delay critical procedures. The preservation of witcher-making knowledge represented paramount concern in design and maintenance of the laboratory, transforming it into archive as much as operational facility. Formulae were preserved through multiple mechanisms, inscribed on paper stored in sealed containers, memorized by masters who trained successors through years of apprenticeship, encoded in physical equipment and devices whose construction embodied knowledge that written description alone could not adequately convey. The redundancy was deliberate, recognition that knowledge stored through single mechanism might be lost through accident or intentional destruction, that multiple preservation methods provided insurance against catastrophic loss if any single storage method failed. The laboratory itself functioned as testament to accumulated knowledge, its very architecture representing decisions made by generations of witches who understood how to create conditions optimal for the transformation process. Safety measures and containment reflected practical understanding that the mutation process could progress catastrophically in directions endangering not merely the candidate undergoing transformation, rather potentially threatening the entire fortress. Chambers were positioned away from areas where populations concentrated, isolated locations ensuring that if containment failed, the consequences remained localized rather than spreading throughout the keep. Construction incorporated barriers separating the laboratory from adjacent chambers, walls sufficiently robust to contain forces that candidates undergoing failed transformation might generate as their physiology destabilized. The fortress itself, through its remote location and limited population, provided ultimate containment strategy, ensuring that catastrophic failure within the laboratory could not spread to impact human settlements or create threats extending far beyond Kaer Morhen's walls. Witches developed protocols for responding to transformation emergencies, procedures governing when candidates should be terminated if their mutation progressed in directions suggesting inevitable failure, guidelines for treatment of bodies if candidates expire during procedures, methods for containing situations where mutation generated unexpected manifestations that witches neither anticipated nor could control. The procedures reflected hard experience, lessons learned from failures at Morgrave and the early years of operations at Kaer Morhen, wisdom accumulated through generations of practitioners who understood that some situations exceeded witches' capacity to intervene beneficially and that swift action sometimes represented greatest mercy available. The laboratory stood as reminder of the moral compromises inherent in witcher existence, physical embodiment of the reality that creating defenders against monsters required inflicting transformation that countless candidates could not survive. The walls had witnessed screams of candidates undergoing the trials, had contained the sounds of suffering that witches deliberately inflicted in pursuit of creating enhanced hunters who could protect human populations. The laboratory represented not abstract ethical problem, rather concrete location where specific humans had perished, where their corpses had been disposed of, where their memory lingered in the minds of practitioners who had conducted the procedures and who lived with knowledge of what their work required in terms of human cost. Children brought to Kaer Morhen to undergo the trials arrived with varying degrees of awareness regarding what awaited them, many having only fragmentary understanding of what transformation would demand or what consequences failure would carry. Some children came voluntarily, having been sold by desperate families or surrendered by orphanages, their comprehension of their circumstances shaped by stories and warnings provided by those responsible for their placement. Others arrived through less transparent means, acquired through intermediaries who asked few questions about the origins of young candidates or the family situations that had made their availability possible. All faced the same progression of preparation and testing, standardized regimen designed to identify which candidates possessed biological capability or psychological capacity required for surviving the trials that would either transform them into witches or terminate their lives. The dietary regime that initiated preparation extended across months of carefully controlled nutrition designed to alter candidates' physiology incrementally before the most dangerous phases of mutation arrived. Mushrooms prepared in specific combinations provided compounds that began restructuring metabolic processes at cellular level, introducing into candidate system substances that their bodies recognized as alien yet which they learned to accommodate through repeated exposure. Mosses and herbs rare enough to require careful cultivation in protected gardens within the fortress supplemented the diet, their effects primarily directed toward preparing digestive systems and organ function for the radically different conditions that the trial of the grasses would impose. The foods tasted uniformly unpleasant despite varying preparations designed to provide palatability, bitterness, and strange aftertastes that candidates consumed under supervision to ensure compliance with regimens that could not be skipped or modified without jeopardizing survival prospects. The dietary preparation separated candidates from normal children in systematic fashion, marking them as different through restriction and careful monitoring of intake. Candidates eating in common spaces where other fortress inhabitants observed them gradually became distinguished from witches and other keep residents, their status as candidates marked visibly through the obvious impact of restricted diet and deliberate consumption of preparations that normal human nutrition would never involve. The separation prepared candidates psychologically for the further transformations that awaited them, beginning process of divorcing them from their original humanity long before the actual mutation procedures commenced. Some candidates found the strange foods tolerable, developing unexpected appreciation for flavors that seemed initially repulsive, discovering that their bodies adapted more readily than expected. Others struggled continuously with dietary requirements, consuming preparations only through force of will and threat of consequences should they fail to maintain compliance. Physical conditioning pushed young bodies to limits that prepared them for trauma ahead while building strength and endurance that would prove essential for surviving the mutation process itself. Candidates ran mountain trails until legs trembled with exhaustion and further movement required conscious override of instinct toward rest, climbed cliff faces that tested grip strength and mental determination through hours of upward progress where single mistake meant termination through fall onto rocks far below. Engagement in combat drills developed reflexes and taught bodies to continue functioning through pain and fatigue, instructors deliberately avoiding praise for achievements while showing minimal sympathy for struggles and failures. The training operated under philosophy that candidates needed to approach their physical limits regularly to expand those limits, that comfort produced weakness while controlled suffering built resilience. Instructors maintained emotional distance from their charges, preventing attachment to children who might not survive to become full witches, demonstrating through their conduct the emotional restraint that witcher work would eventually require. The training killed candidates through exertion and accident, through falls that shattered bodies insufficiently developed to survive impacts on stone, through exhaustion that progressed to organ failure when candidates pushed beyond what their unmutated physiology could tolerate. The casualties accumulated across seasons of preparation, young bodies interred in burial grounds behind the fortress where witches maintained records of those who had not survived the early stages of trials, knowledge of their identities preserved only in documents and in minds of instructors who remembered which candidates had died and when and how they had perished. These early deaths received minimal ceremony, burials that witches conducted with respect yet without elaborate rites that might suggest the candidates had fully become part of witcher community rather than remaining candidates who had failed the process. Mortality rate during the dietary and conditioning stages ran lower than during the trials proper, though higher than any assessment would consider acceptable by standards valuing individual human life. Approximately 1 candidate in 5 perished during the months of preparation, casualties concentrated among those whose bodies proved inadequate to sustained physical exertion or whose psychological capacity for enduring constant discomfort proved insufficient for compliance with regimens requiring absolute discipline. Witches understood that these early deaths represented mercy compared to alternatives the candidates might face, that selecting for candidates capable of enduring such preparation necessarily eliminated those whose constitutions could not possibly survive the mutation process itself. The seemingly cruel training protocols served function of identifying viable candidates before expending resources and taking risks involved in administering actual mutagens. The voluntary nature of candidacy remained subject to examination from multiple angles. Philosophical questions about whether children could meaningfully consent to undergo procedures that would either end their lives or permanently alter their existence transcending their original humanity. Some candidates arrived with full understanding and explicit decision to accept transformation, children old enough to comprehend what awaited them and who had chosen witcher path through deliberate evaluation of alternatives. Others came as infants or very young children, unable to consent to anything, present at fortress because families or authorities had decided their presence was preferable to maintaining them in original circumstances. Still others arrived at intermediate ages, capable of understanding certain aspects of what awaited them yet lacking maturity for fully comprehending the implications of choices being made regarding their futures. The question of consent bothered certain witches, particularly those who remembered their own transformations with clarity that had not diminished through years, who carried memories of the moments when they had understood that the pain was not going to stop, that the transformation was irrevocable regardless of how unbearable the experience became. These witches recognized that genuine consent required possibility of refusal, that true choice involved ability to decline the trials even knowing that declining meant release from the fortress and uncertain future outside its walls. The fortress did not detain candidates against their will explicitly, though the psychological pressure of surroundings and the implications of refusal functioned as coercive force eliminating meaningful choice for many candidates. A child who decided to refuse the trials faced abandonment far from home, uncertain prospects for survival in a world without resources or social connections, implicit understanding that witcher training represented only viable path to meaningful existence their circumstances would allow. The alchemical concoction known as the Trial of the Grasses represented culmination of centuries of experimentation and refinement, process that Alzur had pioneered and subsequent generations of witches had modified and perfected through accumulated experience. The mixture drew ingredients from multiple monster species, each component selected for specific mutagenic properties that the mixture required to function effectively. Fork-tail spinal fluid provided compounds that enhanced reflexes and developed the rapid neural responses that would distinguish witches from normal humans. The fluid's properties understood imperfectly yet proven repeatedly to function as essential element of transformation. Manticore venom contributed substances that accelerated healing processes and modified pain responses throughout nervous system, allowing witches to tolerate trauma that would render unmodified humans incapacitated. Albino bruiser tongue provided rare ingredients whose properties remained shrouded in mystery despite generations of study. Substances that appeared essential to the eye mutation that would grant witches night vision, yet the exact mechanisms through which the tongue's components affected ocular development remained incompletely understood. The botanical components served equally critical functions. Bryonia and axe rib leaf and mandrake root selected specifically for their capability to moderate the toxicity of monster-derived ingredients while simultaneously facilitating their integration into human systems. These stabilizing agents function somewhat analogously to buffer solutions that witches employed in other alchemical procedures, chemicals that reduced extreme reactions without eliminating the essential effects that the primary mutagens required to achieve. The precise ratios of monster-derived to botanical components represented knowledge preserved across generations, formulae that witches maintained through memorization and written records, procedures where deviation from established proportions could result in mutation failure or catastrophic side effects. Administration of the mutagens proceeded according to precise protocol established through decades of experience and refined through observation of variations in outcomes based on different methodology approaches. Initial administration came through oral consumption of prepared tea containing the gentler components, first herbs that opened candidates' bodies to the subsequent procedures by inducing profound immobility and creating physiological conditions that facilitated acceptance of the more powerful mutagens to follow. Candidates rendered immobile through this first preparation appeared conscious yet incapable of voluntary movement, awareness preserved within bodies that would not obey commands, consciousness intact while autonomy evaporated into temporary paralysis that lasted hours or occasionally days depending on candidates' individual metabolic response to the preparation. The second administration involved combination of further herbs and elixirs injected directly into bloodstream through punctures in flesh, delivery method that avoided digestive system entirely and ensured that active compounds reached target tissues with maximum concentration and minimal degradation through gastric processing. The injection triggered responses ranging from violent convulsions as candidates' nervous systems attempted to reject foreign substances to cataleptic rigidity as central nervous system's control of motor function became overwhelmed by shock. The injections continued at intervals measured in hours, with multiple introductions of increasingly concentrated mutagen solutions driving deeper transformation as previous doses prepared body tissues for more extreme alterations to follow. Physical effects commenced immediately following injection, fever spiking to temperatures that would cause permanent neurological damage in unmodified humans, temperatures so extreme that witches monitoring candidates required careful observation to ensure subjects remained alive rather than approaching temperatures where thermally induced cellular death would become inevitable. Skin flushed with patterns of discoloration that tracked spreading of mutations through vascular systems, subcutaneous changes becoming visible to external observation as transformation progressed from initial cellular modifications towards systemic alteration affecting every major organ system simultaneously. Eyes clouded as ocular structures began their transformation toward the cat-like configuration that would mark witches as other for remainder of their existence, irises beginning to shift through colors as mutations to pigmentation cells commenced, whites of eyes acquiring subtle yellow tint that would intensify throughout the transformation process. The process lasted approximately 7 days, candidates cycling through periods of consciousness alternating with episodes of delirium as neurological changes propagated through their brains. Those remaining conscious during coherent intervals experienced the mutation with full awareness of what was occurring, sensation of their bodies being rewritten extending through every nerve ending. Some candidates experienced hallucinations emerging from combination of fever and direct neurological alteration, visions that seemed devastatingly real to experiencing consciousness despite being generated entirely within modified brains processing. The agony of transformation extended beyond physical sensation into psychological realm, minds attempting to comprehend fundamental alterations to the basic nature of their existence, consciousness forced to accommodate body becoming something fundamentally different from what it had been. The survival rate held steady at approximately 3 candidates in 10 successfully completing the trial of the grasses, survival contingent upon multiple factors including individual biological constitution, metabolic response to introduced mutagens, and psychological capacity for enduring suffering that extended beyond what normal human experience typically involved. 7 candidates perished for every 3 who survived, casualties resulting from organ failure as mutagens overwhelmed kidney or liver function, terminating from heart attacks as cardiovascular system proved inadequate to stresses imposed by transformation, expiring from respiratory failure as pulmonary tissues underwent modifications rendering them temporarily incapable of gas exchange. Those who died during the trial of the grasses generally perished during the 5th through 7th days, timing suggesting that transformation required sufficient duration to complete initial cellular level modifications yet remained dangerous until stabilization processes completed. The mutations granted survivors enhanced reflexes that approached prescience, bodies capable of initiating motor responses within timeframes matching or exceeding the speed at which nervous system could consciously process information about threats requiring response. Eyes achieved transformation toward cat-like configuration that enabled superior night vision, irises adapting to rapidly changing light conditions and cones within retina restructuring to increase sensitivity to wavelengths visible in low-light environments. Strength increased dramatically, muscles restructured at cellular level through modifications that increased size and efficiency of individual muscle fibers, modifications allowing witches to generate force that untrained humans could never match. Altered metabolism transformed how surviving bodies processed nutrition and toxins, creating situations where substances lethal to unmodified humans presented merely minor discomfort to witcher physiology, modifications allowing ingestion of poisons that would be rapidly lethal to baseline humans. The transformation imposed cost alongside the capabilities it granted, survivors understanding that what they had become represented price as well as achievement. Witches aged more slowly than unmodified humans, cellular regeneration enhanced through mutations that extended functional lifespan to centuries when non-magical circumstances allowed survival that long. Yet the mutation extended this extended lifespan through processes that witches recognized were not natural, that required constant consumption of potions and elixirs maintaining the mutations themselves, that risked degradation if adequate supplies of compounds supporting the transformation became unavailable. The transformation granted capabilities yet simultaneously enslaved witches to eternal dependence on alchemical knowledge that only witches possessed, creating situation where aging backwards toward unaltered humanity would commence if mutation-supporting substances became unavailable for extended periods. The Trial of Dreams represented the least documented of witcher trials, its exact procedures shrouded in mystery that persisted across centuries despite ongoing scholarly and practical examination by witches tasked with administering it. Unlike the Trial of the Grasses, which involved clearly identifiable alchemical preparations and physical processes observable to external scrutiny, the Trial of Dreams operated according to principles that witches themselves understood imperfectly, procedures that involved consciousness and internal experience more than external chemical alterations. The name itself provided limited clarification regarding what actually occurred during this trial, reference to dreams suggesting states of consciousness that normal humans experience during sleep, yet witches undergoing the trial reported that the experience transcended simple dreaming, that it involved transformation at level deeper than physical mutation, alteration at the very foundation of what constituted individual identity. The effects of the Trial of Dreams manifested primarily through modifications to bone marrow that generated altered hormone production throughout candidate physiology, changes so fundamental that they affected emotional regulation, impulse control, and the basic neurochemistry underlying personality. Witches who survived the Trial of Dreams emerged with neurotransmitter profiles substantially different from baseline humans, alterations creating what some observers viewed as emotional stability surpassing normal human capacity, while others interpreted the changes as form of psychological flattening that reduced capacity for feeling while simultaneously eliminating vulnerability to emotions that might impair decision-making. The trial modified hormonal systems responsible for sexual function and reproduction, inducing permanent sterility through alterations so complete that reversal seemed impossible regardless of what future medical advances might achieve. Night vision represented particularly significant side effect of the trial of dreams, enhancement built upon the foundation of eye mutation initiated during the trial of the grasses, further modification rendering witches capable of seeing in darkness approaching complete absence of light. The trial appeared to restructure not merely ocular tissue rather the neurological processing of visual information, altering how witcher brains interpreted light signals received from modified eyes, essentially retraining consciousness itself to extract meaningful visual information from illumination levels where unmodified human vision detected only undifferentiated darkness. This enhancement provided practical advantage in night hunting, yet it also functioned as permanent marker of witcher transformation, inability to function in bright light without ocular discomfort creating permanent dependence on specialized eyewear for activities undertaken in daylight that directly exposed uncovered eyes to harsh illumination. Sterility as consequence of the trial of dreams carried implications extending far beyond personal reproductive capacity, transforming witches into beings permanently severed from natural cycles of population reproduction through which species perpetuated themselves. The sterility appeared intentional rather than accidental side effect, witches gradually recognizing through systematic observation that all survivors of the trial of dreams emerged infertile, that the alteration appeared universal and inevitable rather than individual variation based on particular candidates' physiology. The permanence of this consequence created philosophical tension regarding witcher identity and future, raising questions about what eternal existence without reproductive capacity might mean for creatures separated from fundamental biological processes that defined all other living organisms. A witcher could live centuries, could accumulate wisdom and experience across lifespan vastly exceeding normal human duration, yet could never create offspring, could never experience the perpetuation of self through reproduction that most humans took for granted. The psychological transformation represented the most profound yet least understood aspect of the trial of dreams, changes occurring at neurological level that fundamentally altered how candidates experienced consciousness and related to their own existence. Survivors reported that something essential within them had shifted, that the person they were after the trial of dreams possessed continuity with their previous self yet felt fundamentally changed in ways they struggled to articulate. Some described emerging sensation of emotional distance, recognizing emotional responses yet experiencing them as though observing someone else's feelings rather than feeling them directly. Others reported heightened clarity of thought following the trial, minds freed from anxieties and attachments that consumed normal human consciousness, thinking processes that seemed to operate with ruthless efficiency unconstrained by emotional considerations that previously influenced decision-making. The mystery surrounding the trial of dreams extended to the actual procedures involved in administering it, knowledge restricted to the handful of witches trained in the process through apprenticeship with masters who understood protocols that surviving written records did not fully explain. Whether the trial involved consumption of particular substances, exposure to conditions or experiences designed to produce specific neurological effects, or entirely different class of procedures remained subject to speculation even among witches themselves. The trial appeared to require deep sleep or altered consciousness state, candidates entering process in beds prepared within laboratories, emerging days later fundamentally changed in ways they could identify yet could not fully explain even to themselves. The finality of the trial of dreams distinguished it from previous trials that operated primarily through physical and chemical alteration, transforming biological substrate through introduction of foreign substances. The trial of dreams appeared to alter consciousness itself in fashion that affected witcher identity at most fundamental levels. Those who failed the trial of dreams, who did not successfully navigate whatever internal processes the trial required, reportedly died quietly in their sleep, bodies showing no obvious signs of trauma yet simply ceasing to maintain life during the night. The mortality rate during this trial appeared lower than the trial of the grasses, perhaps reflecting that by that stage only candidates with demonstrated exceptional constitution were attempting the procedures, perhaps because the trial's mechanism operated differently than the overtly destructive chemical transformation of the grasses. The separation between witches and humans that the trial of dreams accomplished extended beyond purely biological dimension into realm of fundamental consciousness and psychological function, transforming those who survived into beings whose relationship to normal human existence had become severed at core level. A Witcher might learn to mimic human behavior, might interact with humans according to protocols that prevented most observers from recognizing the depths of alienation separating them from the species they had been born into. Yet internally the Witcher experienced existence as member of fundamentally different category of consciousness. The Trial of Dreams appeared to complete what the previous trials had initiated, transforming humans into witches not through incremental alteration, rather through discontinuous leap that crossed boundaries separating mundane from transformed existence. Kaer Morhen, as fully operational training ground and headquarters, attained achievement of its institutional purpose during periods spanning roughly 1.5 centuries following formal establishment of the Wolf School as independent entities separated from a unified order. The fortress functioned with sophistication and efficiency that reflected accumulated experience of witches who had dedicated their lives to perfecting processes and infrastructure necessary for creating and deploying new witches across the continent. The laboratory operated at sustainable capacity, producing candidates at rate that balanced need for new witches with available resources and practical constraints imposed by the fortress's capacity to support training operations. The fortress itself, through decades of incremental construction and refinement, had evolved into facility capable of accommodating multiple generations of witches simultaneously, providing training space, living quarters, and research facilities organized according to design principles that reflected mature understanding of institutional requirements. Multiple generations of wolf witches underwent training at Kaer Morhen, developing individual identities and specializations while maintaining allegiance to school philosophy and mutual respect for brothers who had suffered similar transformation. The fortress accumulated expertise across centuries as knowledge passed between instructors and trainees, each generation building upon foundations laid by predecessors, refining techniques through systematic observation and documentation of what proved most effective in training witches capable of surviving the path. Witches trained at Kaer Morhen developed reputation for versatility and balanced approach to their work, earning respect from other schools despite philosophical differences about how witches should conduct themselves. The wolf approach to contracts, balancing mercenary practicality with ethical consideration, earned them reputation as reliable professionals who could be trusted to complete work without creating collateral complications through excessive moral concern or ruthless disregard for consequences of their actions. Contracts across the northern kingdoms kept wolf witches in constant deployment, individual hunters, and occasionally pairs or small groups working across territories where their reputation had spread through accumulation of successful operations. Witches returning to Kaer Morhen between contracts provided intelligence about monster populations and contract opportunities to those preparing for departure, informal network of information sharing that helped newer witches select work appropriate to their experience levels while ensuring that experienced hunters received contracts offering challenges sufficient to maintain their skills. The fortress operated as hub, point of convergence where witches came for resupply, retraining, and maintenance of equipment that hunting work inevitably required. The cycles of departure and return established rhythm to fortress operations, periods of intense training and activity alternating with seasons when weather rendered certain regions inaccessible and witches congregated at Kaer Morhen in greater numbers. The reputation of the School of the Wolf grew substantially across this golden age, spreading through channels where communities valued services that witches provided and through networks of merchants, nobles, and other intermediaries who hired witches or arranged contracts on behalf of others. Witches from Kaer Morhen became known entities in certain regions, their distinctive wolf medallions earning recognition and occasionally generating resistance from populations that feared witches' presence despite needing their services. The school maintained sufficient prestige to attract qualified candidates for training, young people willing to accept extreme dangers of transformation in exchange for capabilities that would grant them status and sense of purpose that normal human existence rarely provided. The school drew from various sources, orphanages, and desperate families providing candidates as they always had, yet also attracting occasional younger sons of nobility seeking to escape rigid hierarchies and find purpose in witcher work that at least guaranteed autonomy and clear purpose. The winter gatherings became regular institutional feature during this period, all wolf witches who could reasonably reach Kaer Morhen converging at the fortress during months when harsh weather made field work impractical. These gatherings served multiple functions simultaneously, providing opportunities for veteran witches to share information about monster populations and contract developments, for experienced hunters to mentor younger witches still developing their skills, for collective observation of significant events in Witcher calendar. The gatherings reinforced institutional identity and reminded dispersed individual hunters that they remained part of larger community despite months of solitary operation on the path. Stories circulated during gatherings, tales of hunts undertaken and monsters defeated, information about witches from other schools and observations about how different schools' approaches compared to wolf philosophy. The gatherings functioned as a combination of practical working sessions, community celebration, and institutional reinforcement, weaving together individual experiences into collective narrative that defined wolf identity. Knowledge sharing during this period reached sophisticated levels, witches documenting their observations of monsters and effective hunting techniques in written records that supplemented oral traditions. The archives at Kaer Morhen accumulated volumes containing accumulated expertise about monster anatomy, behavioral patterns, ecological relationships, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited through proper techniques and preparation. New witches studied these archives as part of their education, learning not merely through direct instruction rather through examination of detailed records compiled by experienced hunters. The records evolved across generations, previous entries receiving annotations and corrections as subsequent witches refined understanding or identified errors in prior observations. This living archive transformed Kaer Morhen into a repository of practical knowledge that sustained witcher effectiveness across centuries, ensuring that discovery of new tactics or understanding of monster types did not perish when individual witches passed away or retired from active service. The relations between School of the Wolf and other schools during this golden age reflected pragmatism and respect tempered by philosophical differences that precluded close collaboration. Witches from different schools occasionally worked together on contracts too dangerous or complex for single hunters to manage, displaying professionalism that transcended institutional rivalries. Information about dangerous monsters or unusual contract situations circulated through informal networks connecting witches from different schools, suggesting that mutual interest in professional excellence created bonds superseding school affiliations. Yet the schools remained fundamentally separate organizations with distinct identities and different approaches to witcher work, witches from different schools maintaining cordial distance that acknowledged shared heritage while respecting deliberate divergence that had occurred centuries previously during the Schism. The Golden Age represented apex of institutional confidence and capability, moment when the School of the Wolf existed at maximum functional strength with adequate resources, proven training protocols, and reputation sufficient to attract quality candidates. The fortress stood secure in mountains that protected it from conventional threats, staffed by witches who had proved their capability through decades of successful operations across the continent. The future seemed assured, institutional continuity guaranteed through processes that had operated successfully across multiple generations and showed no obvious signs of failing. Few anticipated that this period of stability and achievement would prove temporary, that external events would soon emerge to threaten everything the Wolf School had established and maintained through centuries of careful development and institutional stewardship. The Golden Age would endure until circumstances conspired to bring it to catastrophic end. Growing public hostility toward witches emerged gradually across the latter centuries of the Golden Age, hostility rooted in complex factors that accumulated across generations to transform toleration into active resentment. The monster crisis that had justified witcher creation and provided consistent demand for their services showed signs of diminishing as human settlements expanded, agricultural lands cleared of dangerous predators, and established roads made travel through monster-infested regions less inevitable. The abundance of monsters that had characterized earlier centuries appeared to recede as human civilization advanced and consolidated control over previously wild territories. Witches found themselves operating in a world where their services remained necessary yet needed less urgently than during periods when monster populations posed existential threat to human survival. The reduction in crisis atmosphere that had previously silenced moral objections to Witcher existence allowed criticism that survival desperation had previously suppressed to surface and accumulate. The economic factors contributing to hostility centered on the costs that communities incurred when securing Witcher services. The standard Witcher rates, established through centuries of practice and reflecting the genuine dangers and expertise involved in monster hunting, nonetheless represented significant expense for even moderately prosperous communities. Smaller settlements found themselves in situations where Witcher contracts consumed resources that might otherwise go toward other community needs, where the choice to hire Witchers meant accepting reduced investments in infrastructure, education, or agricultural development. The benefits that Witchers provided were real and valuable, yet they came at material cost that communities increasingly resented, particularly as the relative severity of monster threats declined and communities began to question whether Witchers remained genuine necessity or had become economic burdens sustained primarily for elite protection. Complaints circulated through market networks about Witcher greed, stories exaggerating the fees that hunters charged and emphasizing cases where Witchers had profited from contract negotiations while communities struggled with financial hardship. Religious opposition emerged as force of increasing magnitude during this period, driven partly by clerical establishments whose authority and resources Witchers' success had undermined. The Church positioned itself as guardian of communities' spiritual welfare, yet Witchers provided practical protection against physical threats that many humans valued more than spiritual assurance. The rise of Witcher reputation and the resources communities devoted to securing Witcher services represented competition that ecclesiastical hierarchies had not previously faced. Priests delivered sermons characterizing Witchers as unnatural abominations, beings whose mutations placed them outside divine law and proper creation order, creatures that represented affront to natural order that God had established. The rhetoric intensified across generations as clerical establishments experienced decline in their own influence and resources. Witchers were portrayed not as necessary evils tolerated through pragmatic necessity, rather as inherent threats to proper Christian order, beings whose very existence constituted spiritual pollution threatening communities that harbored them. Mage rivalry and jealousy contributed additional dimension to emerging hostility, as practitioners of magical arts who had not been granted Witcher enhancement viewed the success and resources that Witcher schools accumulated with resentment. Witchers possessed capabilities that most mags lacked, physical advantages purchased through transformation that human magic could not replicate without corresponding sacrifice. Mags observing Witcher effectiveness in monster hunting began advancing arguments that Witchers represented perversion of proper magical practice, that the path Alzur had pioneered represented corruption of legitimate magical knowledge into instrumentality for creating physical supersoldiers rather than knowledge-seeking scholars. The rivalry was particularly acute among mags who viewed themselves as inheritors of legitimate magical tradition while regarding Witchers as unnatural deviation from proper practice. Some mags began suggesting that Witchers could and should be replaced through more sophisticated magical approaches, that investments in Witcher training represented wasteful allocation of resources that might better fund development of purely magical solutions to monster problems. Propaganda spreading through northern townships amplified and coordinated the various sources of hostility into organized campaign against Witcher presence. Stories circulated through taverns and market gatherings characterizing Witchers as not merely expensive nor unnatural, rather as actively dangerous to communities that harbored them. Tales emerged of Witchers murdering innocent humans when contracts grew complicated, of hunters charging increasingly exorbitant fees and forcing communities into debt they could never repay, of mutated monsters created by Witcher presence that posed threats greater than the wild creatures they were supposedly protecting communities against. The propaganda exploited genuine concerns about Witcher costs while introducing pure fabrication alongside exaggeration of documented incidents. A Witcher's accidental harm to innocent bystander became tale of deliberate massacre, a standard contract fee transformed into story of criminal extortion, professional judgment in refusing particular contract reimagined as evidence of Witchers' contempt for communities they supposedly served. The sources of propaganda proved difficult to identify with certainty, though most scholars recognized patterns suggesting coordination by those with resources to fund systematic campaign against Witcher presence. The Church provided organized infrastructure capable of distributing anti-Witcher rhetoric through ecclesiastical hierarchies reaching into most communities. Mage academies possessed knowledge and contacts necessary for ensuring that anti-Witcher propaganda circulated through intellectual networks and influenced educated populations. Local nobles who resented the independence that witches demonstrated, who chafed against hunters' refusal to subordinate their judgment to aristocratic authority, provided additional sources of support for campaigns against Witcher presence in their territories. The propaganda did not require coordination to be effective, yet the patterns of consistency and timing suggested that certain groups had deliberate interest in promoting anti-Witcher sentiment and possessed resources for sustaining such campaigns across decades. The accumulation of resentment proceeded in cycles, periods of heightened hostility alternating with seasons of relative tolerance when particular communities experienced monster problems severe enough to overcome their anti-Witcher prejudices. A town that had spent years listening to anti-Witcher rhetoric and reducing support for Witcher services suddenly faced crisis when unexpected monster infestation threatened livestock and human lives. The crisis forced residents to overcome their accumulated hostility and seek Witcher assistance. The Witcher who arrived to address the problem would find themselves welcomed initially out of desperation, yet often facing psychological tension as community members oscillated between gratitude for services rendered and resentment at fees charged for those services. Once the immediate crisis resolved, anti-Witcher hostility frequently resurged, communities reverting to prejudice as urgency faded and accumulated resentment reasserted itself. The decline of the Golden Age proceeded with deceptive gradualness, few recognizing during the period that institutional foundations supporting Wolf School were being systematically undermined through accumulation of social pressure, economic hostility, and propaganda campaigns that would eventually reach critical threshold. The Witchers themselves, concentrated at Kaer Morhen and operating primarily through individual contracts across the continent, existed somewhat insulated from the full scope of emerging hostility through years when accumulated resentment was still building toward dangerous critical mass. The fortress remained secure, the training operations continued producing new witches at sustainable rates, the winter gatherings at Kaer Morhen reinforced institutional confidence even as external world grew increasingly hostile toward what the fortress represented. Few anticipated that the social pressures accumulating across decades would eventually manifest in direct assault on the school itself, that resentment would transform from abstract prejudice into concrete violence capable of threatening the institutional survival that witches had taken for granted through centuries of relative security. The massacre of witches at Kaer Morhen occurred during mid to late 12th century, culmination of accumulated tensions and hostilities that had been building across preceding decades. The specific date remains subject to scholarly dispute among historians lacking unified written records documenting the event with precision, though most assessments place the assault sometime between 1170 and 1190, perhaps a century before the events that would eventually lead Geralt into Witcher service. The timing reflected point when anti-Witcher sentiment had reached sufficient critical mass that organized violence became politically feasible, when coalitions of those opposed to Witcher presence had accumulated sufficient power to undertake assault that previous generations would have lacked capability to execute. A renegade mage whose identity remains subject to historical dispute provided intellectual and magical foundation for the assault, advancing inflammatory rhetoric that characterized witches not merely as unnatural or economically problematic, rather as existential threat requiring destruction. The renegade mage's arguments drew upon religious language provided by ecclesiastical establishments while incorporating magical expertise that suggested witches might pose threats beyond ordinary human capacity to counter without magical assistance. The mage's rhetoric proved effective in mobilizing broader opposition to Witcher presence, transforming general resentment into focused hostility directed toward Kaer Morhen specifically. Some historical accounts suggest that the renegade mage engineered the assault deliberately, using anti-Witcher sentiment as vehicle for attacking Witcher schools he viewed as competitors or as targets for personal vendetta, though other historians dispute such claims as adding dramatic narrative to events that had more mundane origins. The mob that assaulted Kaer Morhen comprised fanatical followers recruited through combination of religious fervor, economic resentment, and manipulation by those with interest in Witcher destruction. The peasants and townspeople who composed the main body of the assault came from Cadwan regions surrounding the fortress, individuals who had accumulated resentment regarding Witcher costs and presence across years of exposure to anti-Witcher propaganda. The fanaticism that animated their assault went beyond simple economic grievance or practical discomfort with Witcher presence, manifesting a spiritual conviction that witches represented abominations requiring destruction regardless of practical costs. The religious rhetoric proved effective in generating emotional intensity sufficient to motivate populations to risk themselves against witches whose combat capabilities far exceeded ordinary human soldiers. The possibility that mags guided the mob's organization and contributed magical support to the assault remains suggested by historians, noting that successful assault would have been extraordinarily difficult without external assistance beyond what ordinary humans could provide. The assault on Kaer Morhen proceeded despite the treacherous approaches that nature and design had provided as defensive advantages. The killer trail that had claimed countless lives among Witcher trainees proved insufficient barrier to organized assault, where fanatical mobs proved willing to accept massive casualties in exchange for reaching the fortress. The passages and elevated positions that should have allowed small numbers of defenders to repel vastly larger forces became instead scenes of desperate combat, where witches eventually succumbed to overwhelming numbers through attrition and exhaustion rather than through superior tactical positioning. The fortress walls that witches had believed would protect them proved porous against coordinated assault, combining conventional force with magical support that witches lacked adequate capability to counter. The massacre proceeded methodically through the fortress, witches attempting to establish defensive positions and organize resistance while discovering that internal fortifications built for purpose of managing training operations and research provided poor foundation for extended military defense. The Great Hall where witches gathered during winter became scene of desperate combat, where defenders made final stand before being overwhelmed by numbers they could not continue to stem. The laboratory where generations of witches had been created fell to the assault, equipment destroyed and formulae lost as mobs driven by fanatical conviction to eliminate witches and everything they represented systematically dismantled the facility. The archives containing generations of accumulated knowledge about monster hunting and witcher techniques were consumed by fires set deliberately to ensure that knowledge could not be recovered by potential survivors. The massacre claimed the vast majority of witches present at the fortress during the assault, a death toll representing comprehensive destruction of the School of the Wolf at its moment of greatest vulnerability. The witches who died included some of the most experienced hunters and skilled trainers, individuals whose loss meant that knowledge they possessed died with them, that expertise accumulated across decades of service could not be transmitted to surviving students. The slaughter proceeded with deliberation and comprehensiveness that suggested intended extermination rather than simple military victory, mobs continuing to pursue and eliminate witches even after defensive resistance had effectively collapsed. The genocide was thorough, intended to ensure that wolf witches would be eliminated from the continent entirely if possible, that the school would be stripped of resources, knowledge, and personnel necessary for continued operation. Vesemir of the Old stood as most distinguished survivor of the massacre that devastated Kaer Morhen, a witcher whose age and experience placed him among the fortress's most senior practitioners at the moment of the assault. Historical records suggest that Vesemir had been born during the 11th century, making him already ancient by standards of normal human lifespan, even accounting for the extended longevity that witcher mutations granted. He represented repository of knowledge accumulated across centuries of operation, master of training protocols and keeper of formulae that had been preserved through generations of careful documentation and memorization. His presence at Kaer Morhen during the massacre represented symbolic loss beyond the physical casualties involved, death of walking archive that contained knowledge no written record could fully capture or transmit to subsequent generations. His absence during the assault, or his survival through methods that historical accounts describe with less clarity than one might prefer, represented extraordinary fortune in circumstances that claimed nearly all witches present at the fortress. Various accounts describe different mechanisms through which Vesemir survived the slaughter, some suggesting that he was away from the fortress during the assault, engaged in contract work that placed him at distance when the mob overwhelmed the keep. Other accounts suggest that he remained present yet managed to conceal himself among corpses of fallen witches, surviving through deception that allowed him to avoid immediate elimination during the fury of the massacre. The exact circumstances of his survival remain subject to dispute among historians, lacking unified written accounts documenting the event with complete clarity, though all agree that Vesemir alone possessed the knowledge and authority to attempt continuation of the Wolf School after the fortress had fallen. The discovery of aftermath emerged as Vesemir either returned to the fortress following departure during the assault or emerged from concealment after the mob's fury had spent itself and attackers departed believing their work complete. The fortress that had stood for centuries as symbol of Witcher institutional power lay in ruins, structures damaged or destroyed by deliberate assault and fires set to ensure complete destruction. The laboratory that had hosted generations of transformation processes had been methodically dismantled, equipment destroyed, and alchemical formulae that could be recovered burned beyond utility. The archives containing accumulated knowledge had been consumed by flames, centuries of documented experience reduced to ash. The great hall where witches had gathered during winter seasons now served as tomb containing hundreds of bodies in states of decomposition that left identification challenging even for those who had known the fallen individuals personally. The emotional and psychological toll of discovering the destruction extended beyond simple grief at loss of familiar individuals and institutional structures. Vesemir understood immediately what the massacre represented: the attempted extinction of the School of the Wolf and everything it embodied. The assault had been comprehensively planned and executed with ruthlessness, suggesting that destruction rather than mere subjugation represented the goal. The mags and priests who had led the mob had made deliberate effort to eliminate not merely witches, rather the knowledge and capability that would allow Witcher creation to continue. The destruction of the laboratory suggested understanding that preventing new witches from being created would prove more effective at eliminating witches permanently than merely executing those currently living. The weight of being the last keeper of so much lost tradition manifested in ways that profoundly shaped Vesemir's subsequent decades and the choices he would undertake to attempt continuation of the Wolf School. He represented potentially the only survivor who possessed sufficient knowledge to attempt restoration of what had been destroyed, yet that knowledge proved partial and incomplete without the additional expertise that had died alongside the witches who had perished in the massacre. The formulae for creating mutagens existed only partially in recovered written records and in the incomplete memory of single individual, records that might prove insufficient to replicate complex procedures that had benefited from constant refinement and correction across centuries of practice. Vesemir's status as sole survivor created isolation despite the small number of young witches who had escaped death through circumstance similar to his own, absence from the fortress during the assault, or through youth that had caused attackers to overlook them among the corpses. These young witches, including individuals who would become known as Geralt, Eskel, and Lambert, survived yet possessed insufficient knowledge and authority to attempt institutional restoration. They required leadership and guidance from senior practitioners, yet Vesemir represented the only such figure among survivors. The burden of attempting to preserve Witcher traditions despite the loss of key personnel, formulae, and institutional infrastructure fell upon Vesemir alone, responsibility that would define the remainder of his existence and shape the trajectory of the Wolf School through centuries following the massacre. The discovery that Vesemir had survived gradually spread through networks of witches from other schools who maintained awareness of what had transpired at Kaer Morhen, though the isolation of the fortress and the thoroughness of the destruction created significant delay in information reaching broader Witcher communities. By the time other schools learned of the massacre in detail, Vesemir had already begun attempting reconstruction efforts at preserving the young witches who had survived the assault. The minimal material and personnel resources available for restoration efforts meant that Vesemir's task of attempting to maintain wolf witcher traditions and continue training new hunters proceeded under circumstances of extreme constraint and difficulty. The fortress itself, damaged but not completely destroyed, could be rehabilitated with effort and resources, yet the loss of knowledge and the disruption of institutional continuity represented damage far more difficult to repair through simple labor and material investment. The keep in years following the massacre existed as ruin and shelter simultaneously, physical structure standing yet fundamentally transformed from what it had been during the Golden Age when witches gathered there between contracts and trainees underwent the trials that created new hunters. The reconstruction that Vesemir and the handful of surviving young witches undertook proceeded pragmatically within severe constraints of available resources and personnel. The fortress that had once bustled with dozens of permanent residents and hosted 100 or more during winter gatherings now sheltered only a handful of individuals undertaking repairs that priority focused on making the structure habitable rather than restoring it to previous functionality or grandeur. The emotional weight of conducting repairs in spaces marked by massacre, where bloodstains on stone served as constant reminders of fallen comrades, added psychological dimension to work that exhaustion and loss already rendered nearly unbearable. The loss of the formulae and expertise for conducting full trials represented perhaps the most catastrophic consequence of the massacre, damage that transcended what simple material reconstruction could address. The laboratory destruction meant that procedures for creating mutagens had been systematically dismantled, equipment destroyed, and written records consumed by flames that eliminated accessible knowledge. The alchemical formulae that survived existed only in fragmentary form preserved in Vesemir's memory and in partial written records that some surviving witches had maintained. The procedures that depended upon precise measurements and careful observation of effects as specific substances combined and transformed proved difficult to reproduce without corrective feedback from practitioners experienced in recognizing when procedures progressed correctly versus when something had gone wrong. The incompleteness of preserved knowledge created situations where attempted reproduction of the trials risked catastrophic results. The attempted continuation of witcher training following the massacre proceeded despite the absence of full knowledge regarding mutation procedures. Vesemir, and potentially other surviving elder witches attempting to maintain the traditions they inherited by applying incomplete understanding to processes that demanded precision they could not guarantee. The records surviving the massacre suggest that additional witches were created following the assault, yet the exact numbers and success rates remain subject to scholarly dispute. The procedures employed likely differed substantially from those that had been refined across the fortress's operational centuries, producing witches whose mutations might have been less complete or more variable than those generated through full protocols. The individuals created through these abbreviated procedures represented the last generation of witches that would be produced at Kaer Morhen, individuals including those who would eventually become known as Geralt, Eskel, Lambert, and Cohen. No new witches could be created after approximately 2 decades following the massacre, the formulae and procedures proving impossible to reproduce with sufficient reliability to justify continuing attempts that risked casualties among candidates undergoing transformation. The knowledge had been lost despite Vesemir's extraordinary efforts to preserve and transmit it to younger witches capable of potentially continuing research that might restore the complete procedures. The fortress shifted from serving as production facility for creating enhanced humans into serving as refuge and training ground for the handful of witches who had survived the massacre and for those few who had been created through the incomplete procedures attempted in the years immediately following the assault. The transition marked recognition that the School of the Wolf had fundamentally changed, that what survived the massacre represented diminished institution existing at margin of what it had once been. The fortress maintained by a handful of surviving wolves proceeded through decades and centuries as ruins slowly stabilizing, structural repairs reaching point where the keep no longer threatened immediate collapse yet never recovering to the state of comfortable functionality that had characterized its periods of peak operation. The defensive capabilities remained sufficient to prevent casual approach or assault by conventional military forces, the location's remoteness and defensive positioning ensuring that those seeking to complete the destruction that the massacre had begun faced obstacles sufficient to make such undertaking impractical. The fortress became less fortress and more refuge, less actively employed training center and more repository of witcher tradition maintained by diminishing population of practitioners who understood that what they were preserving might perish entirely if continuity could not be maintained despite accumulating losses. Geralt, Eskel, Lambert, and Cohen represented final generation of witches trained at Kaer Morhen, individuals created either during the final years of the fortress's operational period before the massacre or during the immediate decades following the assault when Vesemir and surviving elders attempted to continue training despite incomplete knowledge and reduced resources. These witches would become foundational figures for the School of the Wolf following the massacre, carrying forward traditions despite the institutional transformation that had fundamentally altered what the school represented. Geralt in particular would become most famous of these survivors, his legendary career and subsequent mentoring of other witches ensuring that despite the destruction and attempted extinction, the Wolf School maintained thread of continuity that persisted into historical periods when most assumed the school had died centuries previously. The last generation trained before or immediately following the massacre represented transition point between Golden Age and the period of institutional decline, individuals who carried knowledge of what the fortress had been during its peak operation while simultaneously embodying the compromises and abbreviated procedures that the catastrophic losses had necessitated. Their training proceeded in fortress transformed by violence and loss, under instruction provided by elders attempting to transmit knowledge they themselves could not fully verify or reproduce with confidence. Yet despite the limitations and constraints, these witches proved capable of operating effectively on the path, demonstrating that the abbreviated procedures and incomplete knowledge still produced individuals capable of fulfilling witcher functions despite not matching the comprehensiveness of witches created through complete procedures before the massacre. Kaer Morhen existed in the era documented through the Witcher games as symbol of faded glory and enduring resilience, fortress that had survived centuries of decline while maintaining thread of continuity that connected the Wolf School of the 13th century with its foundational period centuries previously. The fortress stood scarred by centuries of weather and conflict, stone walls bearing marks of assault and time's relentless erosion, yet the basic structure remained functional and defensible despite the limited resources dedicated to its maintenance. The Great Hall continued to provide shelter during winter months when wolf witches gathered to share the season together, its vast chamber insufficient to accommodate the hundreds of witches who had once crowded within during the school's golden age, instead serving a handful of survivors who used the space more from tradition than necessity. The armory retained equipment accumulated across generations, swords and armor bearing marks of the hands that had wielded and worn them, tools of hunters who had long since passed beyond mortal existence or whose deaths had been suffered in circumstances far from the fortress walls. The fortress's role transformed from active training center and production facility into seasonal sanctuary and memorial, location where witches maintained connection to their heritage through wintertime gatherings that reasserted institutional continuity despite the impossibility of creating new witches to replace those who aged and perished. The laboratory that had once hosted the trials stood abandoned except for occasional maintenance, the equipment surviving the massacre gradually deteriorating despite efforts at preservation. No candidates underwent transformation within those chambers. No screams of suffering echoed through corridors as young humans were remade into enhanced hunters, the facility representing archive of capability that the fortress could no longer employ. The archives containing documentation of centuries of accumulated knowledge remained accessible though damaged by the fires that had nearly consumed them during the assault, records preserved through extraordinary dedication by those few who recognized their value despite the loss of understanding necessary to apply that knowledge toward continued witcher creation. A symbol of faded glory and endurance, the fortress embodied contradiction between what it had been during centuries of operation and what it had become through loss and diminishment. The witches who sheltered within its walls understood their situation with clarity born from centuries of experience, recognized that what they were witnessing represented decline toward potential extinction rather than temporary setback from which recovery remained achievable. The fortress represented proof that witches could endure despite catastrophic losses, that the institutional knowledge embedded within surviving practitioners could be preserved and transmitted even without ability to create replacements for those who perished. Yet the endurance was finite, limited by aging of the handful of surviving witches and by inability to create new hunters capable of sustaining the school through indefinite future. The emotional significance of Kaer Morhen for surviving witches transcended rational assessment of the fortress's practical utility or military capabilities, extending into realm of profound psychological and spiritual importance. The keep represented home in sense that few humans possessed, location that embodied identity and continuity despite centuries of institutionalized separation from normal human society. Witches who returned to Kaer Morhen seasonally experienced reconnection with brothers who understood their existence through intimate knowledge of shared suffering, training, and existence separated from human normalcy. The fortress functioned as anchor point in existence that would otherwise consist of endless wandering, contracts undertaken in isolation, and interactions with human populations that rarely extended beyond commercial transactions and professional courtesy. The keep provided what witches could never obtain elsewhere: community of beings fundamentally similar to themselves, understanding rooted in shared transformation and shared rejection by broader human society. Its role as final sanctuary emerged with increasing clarity across 13th century as external conditions deteriorated for witches operating across the continent, as contracts became scarcer and hostility toward witcher presence grew. Kaer Morhen became location where witches could retreat when the path became impossible to sustain, where aging hunters could exist without necessity of accepting contracts pushing beyond their diminishing capabilities, where knowledge and traditions could be preserved even as the world outside grew increasingly hostile to what witches represented. The fortress stood as last bastion of wolf school identity, location where distinctive wolf philosophy and approach to witcher work could be maintained even as other schools similarly faced decline or extinction. The keep preserved what the continent seemed intent on destroying, sheltering traditions and principles that external forces sought to eliminate. The fortress as monument to what witches were, are, and can never be again function simultaneously as inspiration and cautionary tale, embodiment of the rise and subsequent decline of institutional power and capability. The empty chambers that had hosted trainee candidates represented lost opportunity and terminated potential, spaces that would never again echo with sounds of young humans undergoing the trials that created new witches. The abandoned laboratory stood as testament to knowledge lost and capability severed, reminding surviving practitioners that some losses extended beyond human measurement or remedy. The fortress itself seemed to age faster than ordinary stone should deteriorate, as if the structure itself grieved for what it had been and understood that what it currently sheltered represented last gasps of institution drawing toward terminal decline. Kaer Morhen persisted through centuries as embodiment of witcher resilience, refusal to accept extinction even when external circumstances seemed designed toward achieving exactly that outcome. The fortress remained defensible, remained functional, remained occupied by witches who understood their situation yet continued maintaining the keep as symbol of continuity with past and a statement of commitment to persisting into future despite overwhelming likelihood that the future would be brief. The maintenance of Kaer Morhen represented choice undertaken by witches possessing limited resources, choice to preserve ruins rather than abandon what remained, to return seasonally and undertake repairs despite knowing that such efforts could not reverse decline or restore what had been lost. The fortress stood through stubbornness and will more than through practical expectation that the investment would produce proportional return, witches maintaining the keep as act of defiance against forces that sought to eliminate them entirely from human memory and existence. The legacy of Kaer Morhen extended beyond the fortress itself into broader understanding of what the wolf school represented and what witches could aspire toward despite institutional decline and personal suffering. The keep became monument to adaptation and resilience, to maintenance of identity and purpose despite catastrophic loss, to preservation of knowledge and traditions despite systematic effort at their destruction. The fortress served as a reminder that greatness once achieved could not be guaranteed to persist, that institutional capability represented fragile achievement vulnerable to forces both external and internal, that what had been built through centuries of effort could be devastated in moments of chaos and hostility. Yet the fortress also stood as testament to possibility of continuation despite loss, to capacity of survivors to maintain what predecessors had established and to preserve for uncertain future what present circumstances made impossible to perpetuate through normal channels. Kaer Morhen endured as symbol and sanctuary, ruin and refuge, monument and living fortress inhabited by witches too stubborn to abandon what remained even when world had seemingly decided their fate was extinction and irrelevance. Thank you for accompanying us through this comprehensive exploration of Kaer Morhen's founding, development, decline, and enduring legacy. The fortress stands as testament to the extraordinary cost of creating enhanced humanity, to the fragility of institutions despite their apparent permanence, and to the remarkable resilience of those who refused to accept extinction despite overwhelming odds. The School of the Wolf emerged from Alzur's forbidden experiments and crystallized into institutional legacy that shaped the continent's relationship with supernatural threats for centuries. May the stories preserved within these sessions persist as reminder of what the witches were, what they achieved, and the price that their existence demanded from all who encountered them.